Polar bear kills 31-year-old scientist on ice sheet, March 25, 2025. The first thing Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Bennett noticed when she stepped off the Twin Otter aircraft onto the pristine expanse of the Greenland ice sheet was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but something deeper and more profound. A silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical force. The only interruption came from the distant rumble of the plane's engines as pilot Marcus Hendrickson ran through his post-landing checklist, the sound echoing across the infinite white landscape that stretched to every horizon. Sarah pulled her Arctic-rated goggles down over her eyes and adjusted the hood of her expedition parka, the bright orange fabric a stark contrast against the monochromatic world around her. At 31 years old, she had spent the better part of the last decade studying glacial dynamics, but this was her first time setting foot on the Greenland ice sheet itself. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who had devoted her career to understanding ice had never experienced it in its most raw and unforgiving form. "Bennett, you getting your land legs?" called out Dr. James Mitchell, the expedition leader, as he supervised the unloading of their equipment. Mitchell was a weathered man in his late 40s, with 17 years of Arctic research under his belt, and the kind of casual confidence that came from having survived more than his share of close calls in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. His beard, perpetually coated with a thin layer of frost, had earned him the nickname Ice Beard among his colleagues, though few dared use it to his face. "Just taking it all in," Sarah replied, her breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the dry, bitter air. The temperature gauge clipped to her parka read -32 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill made it feel significantly colder. She had trained for these conditions for months, spending countless hours in climate chambers and conducting fieldwork in Alaska, but nothing had quite prepared her for the sheer scale and emptiness of this place. The expedition team consisted of 8 members, each bringing specialized expertise to their month-long research mission, focused on measuring ice core density variations and documenting accelerated melting patterns in this region of the ice sheet. Besides Sarah and Mitchell, there was Dr. Elena Volkov, a Russian climatologist whose previous work in Siberia had earned her international recognition, David Kim, a 26-year-old graduate student from the University of Washington who specialized in ice-penetrating radar, Rebecca Becker-Thompson, a field operations coordinator whose job it was to keep everyone alive and supplied, Tommy Larson, their Inuit guide, whose grandfather had taught him to read ice conditions like other people read books, Dr. Marcus Weber, a geologist from Germany who had spent 3 seasons in Antarctica, and finally, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a marine biologist studying the impact of ice sheet changes on Arctic marine ecosystems. The location they had chosen for their base camp was approximately 180 miles inland from the coast, at an elevation of 8,200 feet above sea level. The coordinates placed them at 72 degrees 15 minutes north, 38 degrees 42 minutes west, in a region that satellite imagery had identified as experiencing unusual ice dynamics. The nearest permanent human settlement was the research station at Summit Camp, roughly 90 miles to the southeast, but for all practical purposes, they might as well have been on another planet. Marcus Hendrickson, their pilot, was a 38-year-old veteran of Arctic flying who had logged over 4,000 hours in polar conditions. His weathered face bore the permanent squint lines of someone who had spent years staring into glaring white landscapes, and his reputation for getting research teams in and out of impossible locations safely was legendary among the Arctic research community. He would be returning in 3 weeks to check on their progress and deliver fresh supplies, then again at the end of their mission to extract the team and their data. "Weather report looks good for the next 5 days," Hendrickson announced as he finished securing the aircraft. After that, There's a possibility of a significant storm system moving in from the west. Nothing you can't handle if you're prepared, but worth keeping an eye on." He handed Mitchell a handheld weather radio and a satellite communication device. "Daily check-ins at 0800 and 1800 hours. If I don't hear from you for more than 24 hours, I start making calls." The process of establishing their base camp took the remainder of that first day. The team worked with practiced efficiency, setting up the large communal shelter that would serve as their laboratory and mess hall, followed by individual sleeping shelters rated for extreme cold. Every piece of equipment had been carefully selected for both functionality and weight, since everything they brought would need to be transported by snowmobile to their various research sites across the surrounding area. Sarah found herself paired with Elena Volkov for shelter setup, and as they worked to anchor the guy lines against the constant wind, she learned more about her Russian colleague's background. Elena was 43 years old, with 2 grown children back in St. Petersburg and a husband who worried constantly about her work in remote locations. She had been studying climate change in the Arctic for over 15 years, and her research had documented temperature increases that were happening faster than most climate models had predicted. "The ice here," Elena said as they tested the tension on their shelter's support system, "it tells us stories about what Earth was like thousands of years ago. But it also tells us what is happening now and what will happen in the future. Sometimes the stories are not so pleasant to hear." As evening approached on their first day, the team gathered in the communal shelter for their first meal together. The shelter's interior was surprisingly warm and comfortable, heated by an efficient diesel-powered heater that Tommy Larson had set up with the kind of casual expertise that spoke to years of experience in harsh conditions. Tommy was 52 years old, born and raised in Qaanaaq, one of the northernmost permanently inhabited places on Earth. His knowledge of ice conditions, weather patterns, and Arctic survival was encyclopedic, passed down through generations of his family who had lived and thrived in the Arctic for millennia. "This ice," Tommy said as they ate their freeze-dried beef stew, "it has been here for maybe 100,000 years or more. But it is changing now, faster than it has ever changed before. My grandfather, he told me stories about hunting on ice that was solid as rock. Now," he shrugged expressively, "now we must be much more careful. The ice, it does not always act the way it used to act." David Kim, the graduate student, had been quiet during most of the day's work, clearly overwhelmed by his first experience in such an extreme environment. He was a brilliant young researcher, but his expertise was primarily theoretical and laboratory-based. This expedition represented his first real fieldwork in Arctic conditions, and Sarah could see both excitement and apprehension in his eyes as he absorbed Tommy's words. "How long have you been guiding research expeditions?" David asked Tommy. 15 years, maybe 16, Tommy replied. "Started when I was a young man helping other guides. Now I know this ice better than almost anyone. But the ice, it is always teaching you new things, sometimes dangerous things." Dr. Marcus Weber, the German geologist, was methodically reviewing their planned research schedule for the following weeks. Weber was a meticulous man in his mid-50s who approached every aspect of his work with Germanic precision. He had downloaded the latest satellite imagery of their research area and was cross-referencing it with historical data to identify the most promising sites for ice core sampling. "According to the satellite data," Weber announced, "there are some interesting formations about 12 kilometers to the northeast that warrant investigation. The ice thickness measurements suggest some unusual layering patterns that could provide valuable insights into historical climate variations." Dr. Jennifer Hayes looked up from her own research materials. At 37, she was recognized as one of the leading experts on Arctic marine ecosystems, and her presence on the expedition was focused on understanding how changes in the ice sheet were affecting marine life in the surrounding waters. "How close to the ice edge are we talking?" she asked. I'd like to get some water samples if we're going to be near the transition zone. Approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest open water, Weber replied, after consulting his maps. Though with the current rate of ice loss, that distance is decreasing more rapidly than historical averages would suggest. The conversation continued as the team members shared their individual research goals and began to coordinate their activities for the coming weeks. Sarah found herself impressed by the depth of knowledge and experience represented in the group, but also acutely aware of how isolated they were. The nearest help was hundreds of miles away, and in the event of a serious emergency, rescue would depend entirely on weather conditions and the availability of aircraft capable of operating in these extreme conditions. As the evening wore on, the team members gradually retreated to their individual shelters to rest before beginning their first full day of research activities. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the constant sound of wind against the shelter fabric and the occasional groaning sound of ice shifting somewhere in the distance. Despite her exhaustion from the long travel day and the physical exertion of setting up camp, sleep came slowly. Her mind was too active, processing the reality of where she was and what they were attempting to accomplish. The second day dawned clear and brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. The team's first priority was to establish their research protocols and begin the systematic process of ice core sampling that would form the foundation of their data collection. Sarah found herself working closely with David Kim to calibrate the ice-penetrating radar equipment they would use to map subsurface ice structures before drilling. "The radar data is showing some really interesting patterns," David observed as they worked through their morning equipment checks. "There are distinct layers here that suggest significant climate events over the past several thousand years. If we can correlate the core samples with the radar imagery, we should be able to build a pretty detailed picture of historical climate variations." The process of ice core drilling was both technically demanding and physically exhausting. Each core sample required careful extraction, documentation, and preservation in specialized containers that would maintain the ice in its natural state during transport back to their laboratories. Sarah had done similar work in smaller-scale environments, but the sheer scope of what they were attempting here was unlike anything in her previous experience. Dr. Mitchell supervised the drilling operations with the kind of focused intensity that had made him one of the most respected expedition leaders in Arctic research. Every decision, from the selection of drilling sites to the depth of core extraction, was made with careful consideration of both scientific value and safety factors. The team's safety protocols were exhaustive, with redundant communication systems, detailed evacuation procedures, and strict buddy system requirements for anyone working away from the main camp. "Remember," Mitchell announced during their morning briefing, "we are operating in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Every decision you make, every piece of equipment you handle, every step you take away from camp needs to be considered in the context of survival. We have excellent equipment and extensive experience, but the margin for error here is essentially zero." Elena Volkov had established a routine of taking detailed meteorological measurements every 4 hours, building a comprehensive picture of local weather conditions that would be crucial for interpreting their ice core data. Her previous work in Siberia had taught her to recognize subtle atmospheric patterns that could indicate significant weather changes hours or even days before they became apparent to less experienced observers. "There is something interesting happening with the pressure gradients," she mentioned to Sarah as they worked side by side during the afternoon drilling session. "The atmospheric pressure has been dropping more rapidly than the weather forecasts predicted. It may be nothing, but in my experience, the atmosphere here can change very quickly. By the third day, the team had settled into a productive routine. Morning briefings at 0700 hours, equipment preparation and safety checks, field work from 0900 to 1600 hours, with a mandatory lunch break back at base camp, data processing and equipment maintenance in the evening, and mandatory rest time beginning at 2200 hours. The routine was designed to maximize their research productivity while maintaining strict safety protocols. Tommy Larson had been increasingly quiet during the morning briefings, and Sarah noticed that he spent more time than usual scanning the horizon with binoculars. When she asked him about it, his response was characteristically understated, but somehow unsettling. "The ice," he said simply. "It has been making different sounds the last 2 nights. And there are tracks I do not recognize near the camp perimeter. Probably nothing, but worth watching." The tracks Tommy had mentioned were barely visible, slight depressions in the wind-hardened snow that could have been caused by any number of factors. But his concern was enough to prompt Dr. Mitchell to implement additional safety measures, including perimeter checks every 2 hours and a strict prohibition on anyone leaving camp alone after sunset. "In all likelihood, it's nothing to worry about," Mitchell explained during their evening briefing. But Tommy's experience in these conditions is invaluable, and his instincts have kept a lot of people alive over the years. We take his concerns seriously, even when we can't immediately identify a specific threat. Rebecca Thompson, their field operations coordinator, had been monitoring their supply consumption rates and weather forecasts with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized her approach to expedition logistics. At 34, she had managed supply operations for over 20 Arctic and Antarctic research expeditions, and her ability to anticipate problems before they became critical had earned her a reputation as one of the best in the field. "We're consuming heating fuel at a slightly higher rate than projected," she reported, "probably due to the colder than expected temperatures. It's not a problem for our current mission timeline, but worth noting for future planning." The 4th day brought their first significant challenge when a minor equipment malfunction with their primary drilling apparatus forced them to spend most of the morning conducting field repairs. Dr. Weber and David Kim worked together to disassemble and rebuild the drill's extraction mechanism, a process made exponentially more difficult by the extreme cold and the need to keep the delicate components from freezing. "At these temperatures," Weber explained as they worked, "metal becomes brittle and seals become unreliable. Every piece of equipment we use has to be specifically designed for these conditions, and even then, we have to constantly monitor for signs of failure." While the equipment repairs were underway, Sarah and Elena took the opportunity to conduct a comprehensive survey of their immediate research area. Using GPS units and detailed topographical mapping, they documented ice formation patterns, surface conditions, and potential hazards that could affect their research activities. The work was painstaking and required constant attention to their position and environmental conditions. "The ice sheet here is more dynamic than I expected," Sarah observed as they worked their way across a section of terrain marked by subtle ridges and depressions. "These surface features suggest significant movement and deformation patterns that could affect the reliability of our core samples." Elena nodded in agreement. "In Siberia, we learned that ice that appears stable can sometimes be moving much faster than expected. The surface gives you clues, but you must know how to read them correctly." As they worked their way across the survey area, Sarah became aware of a subtle change in the quality of light around them. The sun, hanging low on the horizon as it was throughout their Arctic spring expedition, seemed to be dimming slightly, and the wind had picked up to a steady 20-mile-per-hour blow from the northwest. Elena noticed the changes at almost the same moment. "We should return to camp," Elena said, checking her watch. "These conditions can change very rapidly here, and we are already at the limit of our safe travel distance from base." The return trip to camp took longer than expected as they worked their way through increasingly difficult terrain. The wind had continued to strengthen, and occasional snow squalls reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Both women were experienced enough to recognize the signs of potentially dangerous weather development, and they maintained constant radio contact with base camp throughout their return journey. By the time they reached camp, the wind had increased to a sustained 35 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour. Dr. Mitchell immediately called a halt to all outdoor activities and implemented their severe weather protocols. The entire team gathered in the communal shelter to ride out what was clearly developing into a significant storm system. The Weather Service is reporting that this system is moving faster and with more intensity than their models predicted, Mitchell announced, after checking the latest meteorological data. We're looking at sustained winds of 50 miles per hour or higher, with possible gusts up to 70 miles per hour. The temperature is expected to drop another 15 degrees, putting us well into the -50 range. Tommy Larson nodded grimly. This kind of storm, it can last for days. We stay inside, we stay warm, we wait for it to pass. The ice will still be here when the storm is finished. The storm lasted for 2 full days, confining the team to their shelters and significantly limiting their research activities. The communal shelter proved its worth during this period, providing a warm, stable environment where the team members could continue their data analysis work and equipment maintenance while waiting for conditions to improve. During the long hours of confinement, Sarah found herself learning more about her teammates' backgrounds and motivations. Dr. Hayes shared stories of her previous research in the Arctic Ocean, describing the dramatic changes she had observed in marine ecosystems over the past decade. Her work had documented significant shifts in species distribution patterns, with traditionally Arctic species moving further north as their preferred water temperatures changed. The ice sheet and the ocean are more closely connected than most people realize, Hayes explained. Changes in ice coverage directly affect water temperature, salinity, and nutrient distribution patterns. These changes ripple through the entire marine food web, affecting everything from microscopic plankton to polar bears. David Kim used the storm downtime to review and analyze the radar data they had collected during their first few days of operations. Despite his relative inexperience in field conditions, his technical expertise with the radar equipment was proving invaluable for interpreting the complex subsurface ice structures they were studying. The radar is showing some really unusual patterns about 8 kilometers northeast of here, David reported during one of their informal evening discussions. There appear to be significant air pockets or voids in the ice structure that don't match anything I've seen in the literature. It could be naturally occurring, or it might indicate some kind of instability in the ice sheet structure. Dr. Weber immediately showed interest in David's findings. Air pockets in ice sheet structures can sometimes indicate stress patterns or deformation processes that aren't visible on the surface. If we can get detailed measurements of these formations, it could provide valuable insights into how the ice sheet responds to changing temperature and pressure conditions. The storm finally began to subside on the morning of their 7th day in the field. The wind dropped to manageable levels, and the temperature stabilized at -42 degrees Fahrenheit. As the team emerged from their shelters to assess conditions and plan their return to research activities, they found that the storm had dramatically altered the landscape around their camp. The snow drifting patterns have changed significantly, Tommy observed as he conducted his post-storm safety assessment. Some areas that were level before are now showing significant drifts, and there are new crevasse formations visible about 2 kilometers to the east. We will need to update our route planning and safety protocols. The storm had also left behind clear evidence of wildlife activity in the area. Fresh tracks were visible in the newly fallen snow, including what appeared to be Arctic fox prints, and several sets of tracks that Tommy identified as belonging to Arctic wolves. More concerning were a series of much larger tracks that led from the northeast toward their camp before veering away to the southeast. "Polar bear," Tommy said simply as he knelt to examine the tracks more closely. "Large male, probably weighing 800 pounds or more. The tracks are fresh, maybe 6 to 8 hours old. The bear came close to camp during the storm, then moved on. They are curious about human activity, but usually avoid direct contact unless they are very hungry or protecting cubs." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air as she looked at the massive paw prints in the snow. Each print was nearly a foot long and showed the clear impressions of powerful claws. The tracks formed a purposeful line that had brought the bear within perhaps 200 meters of their sleeping shelters before turning away. "How often do polar bears travel this far inland?" she asked Tommy, trying to keep her voice casual despite the anxiety she was feeling. "Not often," Tommy replied. "Usually they stay near the ice edge where they can hunt seals. But when the sea ice breaks up early, or when food is scarce, they will travel long distances looking for anything they can eat. A bear this far inland is probably hungry and possibly desperate." Dr. Mitchell immediately implemented enhanced security protocols based on Tommy's assessment. These included mandatory perimeter checks every hour during daylight, prohibition on solo travel more than 100 meters from camp, and the establishment of a watch rotation that would ensure someone was always monitoring the camp's surroundings for signs of wildlife activity. "Polar bears are magnificent animals, but they are also the Arctic's apex predator," Mitchell explained during their morning briefing. "An adult male can run at speeds up to 35 miles per hour, can swim for miles in icy water, and has no natural fear of humans. Our best defense is awareness, preparation, and avoiding situations where we might be perceived as a threat or a food source." The team resumed their research activities on day 8, but with heightened awareness of their environment and strict adherence to the new safety protocols. Sarah found herself constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, and she noticed that her teammates were doing the same. The knowledge that they were sharing this vast landscape with one of the world's most powerful predators added an element of tension to every activity. Their research was progressing well despite the weather delays. The ice core samples they had collected were providing valuable data about climate patterns over the past several thousand years, and the radar mapping was revealing complex subsurface structures that hadn't been previously documented. Elena's meteorological data was building a comprehensive picture of current atmospheric conditions that would be crucial for understanding ongoing climate change processes. "The ice core data is showing some really interesting patterns," Sarah reported during their evening data review session. "There are distinct layers that suggest rapid climate changes occurred several times over the past 2,000 years. These weren't gradual shifts, but relatively sudden changes that happened over periods of decades rather than centuries." Dr. Weber was particularly excited about the implications of Sarah's findings. Rapid climate change events in the geological record can provide valuable insights into how current climate systems might respond to ongoing greenhouse gas increases. If we can document the speed and magnitude of these historical changes, it could help improve our climate modeling predictions. On their 9th day in the field, the team decided to expand their research area to investigate the unusual subsurface formations that David's radar work had identified. The site was approximately 12 kilometers northeast of their base camp, requiring a full-day expedition with snowmobiles and portable shelter equipment in case weather conditions prevented their return to base camp. The expedition team for this advanced reconnaissance consisted of 6 members: Sarah, Elena, David, Dr. Weber, Tommy, and Rebecca. Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Hayes remained at base camp to continue processing previously collected samples and to maintain radio communication with the advance team. The journey to the research site took nearly 3 hours, traveling across terrain that varied from relatively smooth snowfields to areas marked by significant ice ridges and formations. Tommy led the way on his snowmobile, using his extensive knowledge of ice conditions to select the safest route while avoiding areas that might present hidden dangers. "The ice here is more broken than I expected," Tommy commented during one of their rest stops. "There are stress patterns and formation changes that suggest this area has experienced significant movement recently. We must be very careful about where we set up our equipment." The site they had selected for investigation was marked by a series of subtle surface features that David's radar work had indicated might be associated with the unusual subsurface formations. The area appeared stable and solid, but Tommy's experience reading ice conditions led him to recommend extensive safety testing before they began their equipment setup. "Before we do anything else," Tommy announced, "we test the ice thickness and stability. These formations could indicate weakness or instability that is not visible on the surface. We do not want to find out the hard way that we have set up our equipment over a weak area." The ice testing process involved drilling a series of test holes to measure ice thickness and using specialized equipment to test the structural integrity of the ice layer. The results were both reassuring and somewhat puzzling. The ice was extremely thick and structurally sound, but the subsurface formations that had shown up on the radar remained unexplained. "The ice thickness here is over 30 meters, David reported after completing his measurements. "That's significantly thicker than the surrounding area, which suggests that this might be a very old formation that has been stable for a long time." As the team began setting up their research equipment, Sarah noticed that Elena had become increasingly focused on her meteorological instruments. The Russian climatologist was taking readings more frequently than usual and seemed concerned about something in the atmospheric data she was collecting. "The pressure gradient is changing again," Elena announced, "similar to what we observed before the last storm, but with some different characteristics. It may be nothing, but the atmospheric conditions here can be very unpredictable." Dr. Weber and David worked together to set up the ice drilling equipment, while Sarah and Rebecca established a portable shelter that would provide some protection from the wind and a warm place to process samples. The work was methodical and careful, with constant attention to safety protocols and environmental conditions. The drilling process revealed ice formations that were unlike anything any of the team members had previously encountered. The ice layers showed clear stratification patterns, but with unusual inclusions and air pocket formations that suggested complex formation processes over extended time periods. This ice contains trapped atmospheric samples that could provide incredibly detailed information about historical climate conditions, Sarah observed as she examined the core samples. Some of these air inclusions appear to contain atmospheric samples that could be thousands of years old. As the afternoon progressed, the team made excellent progress with their sample collection and documentation. The site was proving to be even more valuable than they had hoped, with ice formations that could provide unprecedented insights into long-term climate patterns and atmospheric composition changes. Tommy, who had been monitoring weather conditions and maintaining perimeter security, approached the group around 1500 hours with a concerned expression. "We should consider returning to base camp earlier than planned," he announced. "The wind patterns are changing, and there are cloud formations developing to the west that could indicate another storm system approaching." Elena immediately confirmed Tommy's assessment with her meteorological data. "The atmospheric pressure has dropped significantly in the past 2 hours," she reported. If this pattern continues, we could be looking at severe weather conditions within the next 6 to 8 hours. Dr. Weber was reluctant to abandon the research site before completing their planned sample collection. We've made excellent progress here, and this site is providing incredibly valuable data. If we leave now, it might be several days before we can return, depending on weather conditions. The team faced a difficult decision: continue their research and risk being caught in severe weather conditions 12 kilometers from their base camp, or abandon their work and return to the safety of their established shelter. Tommy's experience and Elena's meteorological data strongly suggested that continuing their work would be extremely risky. Safety has to be our primary consideration, Rebecca stated firmly. We have excellent data already, and we can return to this site when conditions improve. The risk of being stranded here during a severe storm is not acceptable. As they began the process of securing their equipment and preparing for the return journey, David made one final radar scan of the immediate area to document the subsurface formations they had been studying. What he saw on his equipment display immediately changed the urgency of their situation. "We have a problem," David announced, his voice tight with concern. "The radar is showing significant movement in the subsurface ice formations. There are stress patterns developing that weren't there this morning. Something is causing structural changes in the ice sheet beneath us." Tommy immediately moved to examine David's radar display, and his expression became grim as he interpreted the data. "The ice is moving," he said simply. "Not much, but enough to create stress patterns that could lead to surface cracking or instability. We need to leave this area immediately." The team abandoned their equipment setup and began a rapid but careful retreat from the research site. The ice beneath them felt solid and stable, but Tommy's experience and David's radar data indicated that they were operating on ice that was experiencing structural stress that could lead to dangerous conditions. As they loaded their snowmobiles and prepared for the return journey, Sarah took one final look at the research site that had been providing such valuable data. The surface showed no signs of the subsurface movement that David's radar had detected, but she could see subtle changes in the snow patterns that might indicate ice movement beneath. The return journey to base camp was accomplished without incident, though the team maintained constant radio contact and traveled in close formation to ensure that any problems could be immediately addressed. The wind was picking up, as Elena and Tommy had predicted, and by the time they reached base camp, conditions were clearly deteriorating toward another significant storm. Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Hayes were relieved to see the advance team return safely, and they immediately helped with the process of securing equipment and preparing the camp for the approaching storm. The meteorological data that Elena had collected during their expedition confirmed that they were about to experience weather conditions that could be even more severe than the previous storm. "Wind speeds are predicted to reach 60 to 70 miles per hour, Mitchell announced after reviewing the latest weather data. Temperature is expected to drop to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the storm could last for up to 4 days. We're implementing full severe weather protocols immediately." As the team prepared their shelters for the approaching storm, Tommy took Sarah aside for a private conversation. His expression was serious, and she could tell that something about their expedition to the advanced research site had troubled him beyond the immediate safety concerns. "The ice movement that David detected," Tommy said quietly, "it is not normal for this area. In my experience, when ice starts moving like that, it usually means that something significant is changing in the overall ice sheet structure. It could be related to temperature changes, or it could indicate more serious problems." "What kind of problems?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The ice sheet here has been stable for thousands of years," Tommy explained. "When it starts to move and change, it usually means that the fundamental conditions that kept it stable are changing. That could mean anything from accelerated melting to structural instability that could affect large areas of the ice sheet. The storm that hit them that evening was indeed more severe than their previous experience. The wind reached sustained speeds of over 60 miles per hour, with gusts that Sarah estimated exceeded 80 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to -58 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions that would be lethal for anyone exposed outside for more than a few minutes. The communal shelter, designed to withstand extreme Arctic conditions, groaned and flexed under the assault of the wind, but held firm throughout the night. The team members took turns monitoring the shelter's structural integrity and maintaining the heating system that kept the interior temperature at a survivable level. During the second day of the storm, Rebecca discovered that their communications equipment was experiencing intermittent failures due to the extreme conditions. The satellite communication device that maintained their contact with the outside world was functioning, but with reduced reliability that made regular check-ins with their pilot and emergency contacts more difficult. "We're still able to establish contact," Rebecca reported, "but the signal strength is weak and intermittent. If we had a real emergency, we might have difficulty communicating our situation to rescue authorities." The storm lasted for 3 full days, the longest period of severe weather the team had experienced since beginning their expedition. When conditions finally began to improve on the morning of their 13th day in the field, they emerged from their shelters to find that the landscape around their camp had been dramatically altered once again. The wind had created massive snowdrifts that buried some of their equipment caches and had scoured other areas down to bare ice. More concerning were the visible changes in the ice surface structure around their camp. New cracks and pressure ridges had appeared, and several areas that had been level before the storm now showed significant elevation changes. "The ice sheet has definitely moved during the storm," Tommy observed as he conducted his post-storm assessment. "These surface changes indicate structural movement that goes much deeper than just wind effects. We are seeing the results of the subsurface movement that David detected at the research site." Elena's post-storm meteorological analysis revealed that the storm had been accompanied by atmospheric pressure changes that exceeded anything in her previous experience. The data suggested that they had experienced weather conditions that represented an extreme event, even by Arctic standards. "The atmospheric dynamics during this storm were unlike anything I have documented before," Elena reported during their post-storm briefing. "The pressure gradients and temperature variations suggest that we are seeing weather patterns that may be related to larger-scale climate changes in the Arctic." As the team began the process of assessing their equipment and resuming their research activities, David made a discovery that would prove to be crucial for understanding the events that were about to unfold. His post-storm radar scanning of the area around their camp revealed that the subsurface ice movement they had detected at the advanced research site had continued during the storm and had spread throughout a much larger area. The radar data shows significant subsurface ice movement across an area of at least 20 square kilometers, David reported. The movement appears to be accelerating, and it's creating stress patterns that could lead to surface instability or even ice sheet fracturing. Dr. Weber immediately recognized the implications of David's findings. If the ice sheet in this area is experiencing widespread structural instability, it could affect our ability to safely continue our research here. More importantly, it could indicate that we're witnessing a significant climate-related event that needs to be documented and reported immediately. The team spent the remainder of their 13th day conducting comprehensive assessments of their situation and the changing conditions around their camp. The ice surface still appeared solid and stable for their immediate needs, but the subsurface movement patterns suggested that they were operating in an environment that was experiencing rapid and potentially dangerous changes. "We need to consider our options carefully," Dr. Mitchell announced during their evening briefing. "We can continue our research with enhanced safety protocols, or we can request early extraction if we determine that conditions have become too dangerous to continue safely." The decision was made more complex by the fact that their research was providing unprecedented insights into Arctic climate dynamics and ice sheet behavior. The data they were collecting could be crucial for understanding how the Arctic was responding to global climate change, and early termination of the expedition would mean losing access to this valuable research opportunity. Tommy's assessment of their situation was characteristically straightforward. "The ice is changing faster than I have ever seen before," he said simply. "In my grandfather's time, ice like this was stable for many years. Now it changes from day to day. We can continue working, but we must be prepared to leave quickly if conditions become more dangerous." Sarah found herself torn between her scientific curiosity about the phenomena they were observing and her growing concern about their safety. The ice sheet movement and structural changes they were documenting were exactly the kind of climate-related events that her research was designed to study. But experiencing them firsthand was proving to be more challenging than she had anticipated. "From a research standpoint, we're documenting exactly the kinds of processes that we came here to study," she observed during their evening discussion. "The question is whether we can continue to collect this data safely, or whether the conditions that are creating these valuable research opportunities are also creating unacceptable risks." The 14th day brought clear skies and relatively calm conditions, allowing the team to resume their research activities with enhanced safety protocols. Elena's meteorological monitoring indicated stable atmospheric conditions for at least the next 72 hours, providing a window of opportunity to continue their data collection while carefully monitoring the evolving ice sheet conditions. David's continued radar monitoring revealed that the subsurface ice movement was stabilizing, though at a new baseline that indicated permanent structural changes in the ice sheet. The movement pattern suggested that the ice sheet was adapting to new stress conditions, possibly related to temperature changes or other climate factors. "The subsurface movement appears to be stabilizing," David reported, "but at levels that indicate the ice sheet structure has permanently changed. We're essentially observing the ice sheet adapting to new environmental conditions in real time." Dr. Weber and Sarah worked together to collect additional ice core samples from areas that showed evidence of recent structural changes. The samples would provide valuable information about how rapidly changing conditions were affecting ice formation and structure at the molecular level. The ice cores from areas affected by recent movement showed clear evidence of stress-related changes in ice crystal structure and composition. The data suggested that the ice was responding to changing temperature and pressure conditions much more rapidly than previous research had indicated was possible. These ice samples show structural changes that occurred over days or weeks, not the years or decades that previous models predicted, Sarah observed as she analyzed the core samples. "We're seeing evidence that ice sheet structures can adapt to changing conditions much more rapidly than we previously understood." As the team continued their research activities, Tommy maintained his enhanced monitoring of their surrounding environment for signs of wildlife activity. The polar bear tracks they had observed after the previous storm had been joined by additional signs of wildlife movement in the area, including what appeared to be more recent bear activity. "There are fresh tracks from at least 2 different bears," Tommy reported during their afternoon check-in. "The tracks suggest they are moving through this area regularly, possibly following some kind of travel route or searching for food sources. We must maintain our security protocols and be prepared for possible bear encounters." The presence of multiple polar bears in their area added another layer of complexity to their safety considerations. While polar bears typically avoided human contact, hungry bears or bears with cubs could be unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The team's safety protocols included specific procedures for bear encounters, but Tommy's experience suggested that prevention was always preferable to confrontation. Polar bears are intelligent and curious, Tommy explained during their evening briefing. They will investigate anything unusual in their territory, including our camp and equipment. Our best defense is to maintain clean campsites, secure all food and scented items, and be constantly aware of our surroundings. The 15th day of their expedition began with what appeared to be ideal research conditions. Clear skies, light winds, and stable temperatures provided an opportunity to conduct extended fieldwork without the weather-related constraints they had faced during the previous week. The team decided to return to their advanced research site to continue the investigation of the unusual subsurface ice formations. The expedition team for this return visit consisted of Sarah, Elena, David, Tommy, and Rebecca, with Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Weber remaining at base camp to continue processing samples and monitoring communications. The decision to maintain a smaller advance team was based on both safety considerations and the need to ensure adequate staffing at their base camp. The journey to the research site revealed that the ice surface changes they had observed around their camp extended throughout the surrounding area. New pressure ridges and surface formations were visible across the landscape, providing clear evidence of the widespread ice sheet movement that David's radar work had documented. "The surface changes are much more extensive than I expected," Elena observed, as they traveled across terrain that had been noticeably altered by recent ice movement. "These kinds of changes usually take years to develop, but we're seeing them happen over days or weeks." When they reached their previous research site, they found that their equipment cache had been disturbed. The protective covering had been torn away, and several pieces of equipment showed clear evidence of having been investigated by large animals. Tommy's examination of the disturbance revealed the unmistakable signs of polar bear activity. "At least 2 bears, possibly 3, Tommy announced after examining the site. "They were here recently, probably within the last 24 hours. They investigated all of our equipment, but most of it appears to be undamaged. Bears are curious, but they usually lose interest if they don't find food." The team proceeded with caution as they re-established their research setup, maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings and implementing enhanced security protocols. Rebecca positioned herself as a dedicated lookout while the others focused on their scientific work, and they established a rotation system that ensured someone was always monitoring for signs of wildlife activity. David's radar work revealed that the subsurface ice formations at the site had continued to change since their previous visit. The stress patterns he had detected were still present, but had evolved into new configurations that suggested ongoing adaptation to changing conditions. "The subsurface structures are continuing to evolve," David reported. "The ice sheet appears to be finding a new equilibrium state in response to whatever environmental changes are driving these structural adaptations." As Sarah and Elena worked to collect additional ice core samples from the site, they noticed that the ice drilling was encountering unexpected resistance at certain depths. The drilling equipment was functioning properly, but the ice itself seemed to have areas of unusual density or hardness that hadn't been present during their previous sampling efforts. "The ice composition appears to have changed since our last visit," Sarah observed as she examined the drilling resistance data. "There are layers of much denser ice at specific depths that could indicate rapid freezing or compression events. The team worked efficiently to complete their planned sampling and documentation before the afternoon deadline that Tommy had established for their return to base camp. The enhanced security protocols and constant wildlife monitoring had reduced their work efficiency, but they were still able to collect valuable samples and data from the site. As they prepared for their return journey, Rebecca noticed movement on the horizon to the northeast. Using binoculars, she was able to identify what appeared to be a large polar bear moving across the ice in their general direction. The bear was still several kilometers away, but its travel path suggested it might eventually pass near their location. "Large bear approaching from the northeast," Rebecca announced calmly. "Distance approximately 3 kilometers and closing slowly. The bear appears to be following a direct travel route rather than actively hunting, but we should prepare for a possible encounter." Tommy immediately took charge of the situation, implementing the team's polar bear encounter protocols with the kind of calm efficiency that spoke to his extensive experience with Arctic wildlife. The team quickly secured their equipment and prepared their deterrent devices while maintaining visual contact with the approaching bear. "We pack up now and move back toward base camp," Tommy announced. "We do not run, we do not panic, but we put distance between us and the bear while we still can. If the bear continues to approach, we have deterrent options, but avoidance is always the better choice." The team conducted an orderly withdrawal from the research site, loading their equipment onto the snowmobiles while maintaining constant observation of the approaching bear. The animal appeared to be following an established travel route rather than specifically targeting their location, but its size and proximity made it a potential threat that required careful management. "The bear is approximately 800 to 1,000 pounds, Tommy estimated as they began their return journey. "Adult male, probably 5 or 6 years old. He is traveling with purpose, not hunting behavior, but bears can change their behavior quickly if they perceive food or threat." The return journey to base camp was conducted at a measured pace that balanced the need to maintain distance from the polar bear with the safety requirements of traveling across challenging ice terrain. The team maintained radio contact with base camp throughout the journey, providing regular updates on their position and the bear's location. As they traveled, Elena noticed that the atmospheric conditions were beginning to change once again. Cloud formations were developing to the west, and her portable meteorological instruments indicated dropping atmospheric pressure that could signal another approaching weather system. "We may be looking at another storm system developing," Eleanor reported during one of their rest stops. "The pressure patterns are similar to what we observed before the previous storms, but the development rate appears to be accelerating." By the time they reached base camp, the polar bear had changed direction and was no longer following a path that would bring it near their location. However, Tommy's post-expedition assessment indicated that their area was clearly part of a regular travel corridor for polar bears, increasing the likelihood of future encounters. "This area is definitely part of a bear travel route," Tommy confirmed. "We have seen multiple bears over the past week, and they are moving through this area regularly. It is not necessarily dangerous, but it means we must maintain constant awareness and security protocols." Dr. Mitchell's analysis of their current situation took into account the evolving ice sheet conditions, the increasing frequency of severe weather events, and the confirmed presence of multiple polar bears in their area. The combination of factors was creating a risk profile that required careful consideration of their continued operations. "We are operating in an environment that is more dynamic and potentially dangerous than our original risk assessments anticipated," Mitchell concluded during their evening briefing. "The question is whether the valuable research we're conducting justifies the increased risks, or whether we should consider early termination of the expedition." The team faced a difficult decision as they entered their third week in the field. Their research was providing unprecedented insights into Arctic climate dynamics and ice sheet behavior, documenting processes that were crucial for understanding global climate change. However, the combination of unstable ice conditions, severe weather patterns, and polar bear activity was creating safety challenges that hadn't been anticipated in their original planning. From a scientific standpoint, we're collecting exactly the kinds of data that the research community desperately needs, Dr. Weber argued. The ice sheet changes we're documenting are happening in real time, and this may be our only opportunity to observe and measure these processes directly. Tommy's perspective was more focused on immediate survival considerations. The ice and weather conditions are changing faster than I have seen in 30 years of Arctic experience, he stated simply. We can continue working, but we must be prepared to evacuate immediately if conditions become more dangerous. Sarah found herself at the center of the decision-making process, since much of the research they were conducting was directly related to her doctoral work and research interests. The data they were collecting would be invaluable for her career and for the broader scientific understanding of Arctic climate change, but she was also acutely aware of the risks they were facing. I think we can continue for another week, she finally said, but with enhanced safety protocols and a commitment to immediate evacuation if Tommy or any team member determines that conditions have become too dangerous to continue. The decision to continue their research for another week was made with the understanding that their pilot, Marcus Hendrickson, would be conducting his scheduled supply and status check in 4 days. This would provide an opportunity to reassess their situation with fresh outside perspective and to arrange for early evacuation if conditions warranted. The 16th day of their expedition brought weather conditions that initially appeared favorable for continued research activities. However, Elena's detailed meteorological monitoring revealed atmospheric patterns that suggested significant weather changes could develop rapidly and with little warning. The atmospheric conditions are becoming increasingly unstable, Elena reported during their morning briefing. We're seeing pressure variations and temperature gradients that could produce severe weather events with very little advance warning. We need to be prepared for rapid weather changes throughout the day. Despite the weather concerns, the team decided to conduct research activities close to their base camp, focusing on detailed analysis of the ice sheet changes they had been observing in their immediate area. This would allow them to continue their valuable research while maintaining easy access to their secure shelters if conditions deteriorated. David's radar monitoring of their local area revealed that the subsurface ice movement was continuing, but had developed into more stable patterns that suggested the ice sheet was adapting to whatever environmental changes were driving the structural modifications. The data provided valuable insights into how ice sheets responded to rapid climate changes. The subsurface ice structures appear to be reaching a new equilibrium state, David reported as he analyzed the latest radar data. The movement patterns are stabilizing, but at configurations that are significantly different from the historical baseline for this area. As Sarah and Dr. Weber worked on processing and analyzing their ice core samples, they made discoveries that provided crucial insights into the speed and magnitude of climate changes that had occurred in this region over the past several decades. The ice contained atmospheric samples that documented environmental changes happening much faster than previous research had indicated. These ice cores contain evidence of atmospheric composition changes that occurred over periods of years, not decades, Sarah observed as she analyzed the chemical composition of their samples. We're seeing documentation of climate changes happening at rates that are much faster than current climate models predict. Tommy maintained his vigilant monitoring of their surroundings for signs of wildlife activity, and his observations indicated that polar bear activity in their area was increasing rather than decreasing. Fresh tracks from multiple bears were visible around their camp perimeter, and the patterns suggested that their location was becoming a regular stop for bears traveling through the area. "The bear activity is definitely increasing," Tommy reported during their afternoon check-in. "We now have tracks from at least 4 different bears, including what appears to be a female with cubs. A mother with cubs is much more dangerous than solitary males because she will aggressively defend her cubs against any perceived threat." The presence of a female polar bear with cubs significantly elevated the danger level for the expedition team. Mother bears were notoriously protective and unpredictable and would attack anything they perceived as a threat to their cubs without warning. Tommy immediately implemented enhanced security protocols that included mandatory group movement and continuous perimeter monitoring. "When there are cubs in the area, the rules change completely," Tommy explained. "A mother bear will attack first and investigate later if she thinks her cubs are threatened. We must assume that any bear we encounter could be a mother protecting cubs, and we must be prepared to defend ourselves if necessary." As the afternoon progressed, Elena's meteorological monitoring detected the rapid development of weather conditions that exceeded even her pessimistic predictions. Atmospheric pressure was dropping at a rate that indicated an extremely severe storm system was approaching, with potential for wind speeds and temperature conditions that could be life-threatening. "We need to implement emergency weather protocols immediately," Elena announced. "The atmospheric data indicates we could be facing wind speeds of 80 miles per hour or higher, with temperatures dropping to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. This storm could be more severe than anything we've experienced so far." The team immediately began preparations for what could be the most dangerous weather event of their expedition. All outdoor equipment was secured or moved to protected locations. Emergency supplies were checked and positioned for easy access, and communication equipment was tested to ensure they could maintain contact with the outside world during the storm. As they completed their storm preparations, Rebecca noticed unusual movement patterns in the distance that prompted her to use binoculars for a more detailed observation. What she saw immediately changed the urgency of their situation beyond just weather concerns. "We have multiple polar bears approaching from different directions," Rebecca announced, her voice tight with concern. "I count at least 3 bears, possibly 4, moving toward our location from the north and east. One group appears to include cubs." Tommy immediately took charge of the situation, recognizing that they were facing a potential crisis that combined severe weather conditions with a dangerous wildlife encounter. The approaching storm would make evacuation impossible, while the presence of multiple polar bears, including a mother with cubs, created an immediate threat to their safety. "We prepare for siege conditions," Tommy announced with grim determination. "We secure the camp against both the storm and the bears. We prepare our deterrent devices, and we pray that the bears move on before the storm hits. If they do not move on, we may have to defend our position until the storm passes." The next several hours would prove to be the most challenging and dangerous period of the entire expedition. The team worked frantically to implement both storm protection and bear deterrent measures while monitoring the approach of multiple threats that could converge on their locations simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell established radio contact with their pilot, Marcus Hendrickson, to report their situation and request emergency standby status. However, the developing storm conditions would make any rescue attempt impossible for at least the next 24 to 48 hours, meaning the team would have to manage the crisis with their own resources. "Hendrickson is aware of our situation and will attempt emergency extraction as soon as weather conditions permit," Mitchell reported. "However, we're on our own until this storm passes. We need to focus on survival and hope that the bears lose interest in our location before conditions become critical. As evening approached on their 16th day, the expedition team found themselves facing a convergence of dangerous conditions that would test their preparation, experience, and survival skills to the absolute limit. The approaching storm represented a severe threat to their survival, while the presence of multiple polar bears created an additional layer of danger that could prove fatal if not managed correctly. Sarah stood at the observation window of their communal shelter, watching the approaching storm clouds build on the western horizon, while keeping a careful watch for any sign of the polar bears that were somewhere in the gathering darkness around their camp. In less than 18 hours, their scientific expedition had transformed into a survival situation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about operating safely in the Arctic. The wind was already beginning to increase as the first effects of the approaching storm reached their location. Within hours, they would be dealing with conditions that could be the most severe they had ever encountered, while simultaneously managing the threat posed by multiple polar bears that showed no signs of moving away from their camp. "Whatever happens in the next 24 hours," Tommy said quietly, as he checked their bear deterrent devices one final time, "we stick together, we follow protocols, and we do whatever it takes to survive until help can reach us. This is what all our training and preparation has been leading up to." As the storm intensified and darkness settled over the Greenland ice sheet, the 8 members of the research expedition prepared to face the greatest challenge of their lives. Knowing that their survival would depend on their ability to weather both the fury of an Arctic storm and the unpredictable danger posed by some of the world's most powerful predators. The storm hit their camp with unprecedented fury just after midnight on their 17th day. Wind speeds reached sustained levels of 85 miles per hour, with gusts that Sarah estimated exceeded 100 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to -62 degrees Fahrenheit, creating wind chill conditions that would be instantly fatal for anyone exposed outside. The communal shelter, designed to withstand extreme Arctic conditions, was tested beyond its design specifications as the storm raged around them. The structure groaned and flexed under the assault of the wind, while the heating system worked at maximum capacity to maintain survivable interior temperatures against the unprecedented cold outside. "The shelter is holding, but we're right at the limit of what these structures were designed to handle," Rebecca reported as she monitored the stress indicators on their emergency equipment. "If conditions get any worse, we may need to consider emergency protocols." Tommy maintained a constant watch on their perimeter security systems, monitoring for any signs of polar bear activity despite the severe storm conditions. The bears that had been approaching their camp before the storm hit had presumably sought shelter somewhere, but Tommy's experience suggested that they might remain in the area and could pose a significant threat once the storm passed. "Bears are very good at finding shelter and surviving storms," Tommy explained during one of their emergency status briefings. "They may be waiting out the storm somewhere nearby, and they could return to investigate our camp once conditions improve. We must be prepared for bear encounters as soon as the storm subsides." Elena's meteorological monitoring equipment continued to function throughout the storm, providing valuable data about the extreme weather conditions they were experiencing. The measurements confirmed that they were dealing with weather conditions that represented an extreme event, even by Arctic standards. "This storm is producing atmospheric conditions that are beyond anything in the historical record for this region," Elena reported. "We're experiencing weather that is unprecedented in terms of both intensity and duration. The atmospheric dynamics are unlike anything I have documented in 15 years of Arctic research." Dr. Weber and David worked together to maintain their communication equipment, and ensure that they could re-establish contact with the outside world once the storm passed. The satellite communication systems were functioning intermittently, but the severe atmospheric conditions were making reliable communication difficult. "We're able to maintain sporadic contact with emergency services," Weber reported, "but the signal strength is weak and unreliable. Once the storm passes, we should be able to re-establish full communication capabilities and coordinate with rescue services if necessary." As the storm continued through the night and into the following day, the team members took turns monitoring their emergency systems and maintaining the heating equipment that was keeping them alive in the extreme conditions. The confined conditions and stress of their situation created psychological challenges that were nearly as difficult to manage as the physical threats they were facing. Sarah found herself thinking about the rapid sequence of events that had brought them to this crisis point. Their scientific expedition had been progressing successfully until the combination of unstable ice conditions, severe weather, and polar bear activity had created a perfect storm of dangerous circumstances that challenged their survival. "The irony is that we're experiencing exactly the kinds of extreme climate events that our research is designed to study," she observed during one of their confined conversations. "We're getting a first-hand demonstration of how rapidly Arctic conditions can change and how dangerous those changes can be." Dr. Hayes had been quietly monitoring their supply levels and calculating their consumption rates under the current emergency conditions. Her analysis indicated that they had adequate supplies to survive the current crisis, but that extended isolation could create resource challenges that would require careful management. "Our food and fuel supplies are adequate for our current situation," Hayes reported, "but if we're stranded here for an extended period, we'll need to implement strict rationing protocols to ensure we can survive until rescue operations can reach us." The storm finally began to subside on the morning of their 18th day, though conditions remained severe enough to prevent any outdoor activities. As the wind speeds dropped below 50 miles per hour and the temperature stabilized at -50 degrees Fahrenheit, the team began preparations for assessing their situation once conditions permitted safe movement outside their shelter. "The storm is weakening, but we're still dealing with dangerous conditions," Tommy announced as he monitored weather conditions through their shelter's observation windows. "We need to wait for wind speeds to drop below 30 miles per hour before we can safely venture outside to assess our situation." As conditions continued to improve throughout the morning, Tommy began to see signs of movement in the distance that suggested the polar bears that had been in their area before the storm were still present and active. The animals had presumably found shelter during the worst of the storm, but they appeared to be resuming their normal activities as conditions improved. "We have bear activity visible to the northeast," Tommy reported after careful observation with binoculars. "At least 2 bears, possibly more, moving across the ice approximately 1 kilometer from our position. They appear to be following the same travel routes they were using before the storm." The team faced a critical decision about when and how to venture outside their shelter to assess their situation and re-establish communication with the outside world. The presence of polar bears in their immediate area meant that any outdoor activities would need to be conducted with extreme caution and comprehensive safety protocols. Dr. Mitchell established a priority list for their post-storm activities. First, assess the structural integrity of their shelters and equipment. Second, re-establish reliable communication with emergency services. Third, evaluate their supply situation and determine how long they could continue operations independently. And fourth, assess the feasibility of continuing their research mission versus requesting emergency evacuation. "Our immediate priority is survival and communication," Mitchell announced. "Everything else is secondary, until we've ensured our safety and re-established contact with the outside world. Once we've accomplished those objectives, we can evaluate our options for the remainder of the expedition. Tommy volunteered to conduct the initial post-storm reconnaissance, using his extensive Arctic experience to assess conditions while minimizing exposure to both environmental hazards and polar bear encounters. He would be equipped with emergency communication devices and bear deterrent equipment, with strict protocols for immediate retreat if conditions prove too dangerous. "I will check the camp perimeter and assess our immediate situation," Tommy announced as he prepared for the reconnaissance mission. "I will maintain radio contact throughout the operation, and I will return immediately if I encounter any signs of bear activity or other hazards." The reconnaissance mission revealed that their camp had survived the storm better than expected, though several pieces of equipment had been damaged by the extreme wind conditions. More concerning was the discovery of fresh polar bear tracks throughout the camp area, indicating that the bears had investigated their location during or immediately after the storm. "The bears were here during the storm," Tommy reported upon his return. "Fresh tracks throughout the camp area, including around our shelter entrances. They investigated everything, but did not attempt to access our shelters. However, they are definitely still in the area, and we must assume they will return." The team's communication equipment had suffered some damage during the storm, but Dr. Weber and David were able to restore partial functionality that allowed them to re-establish contact with emergency services and their pilot. The news they received was both reassuring and concerning. "Hendrickson is aware of our situation and is standing by for emergency extraction," Weber reported after re-establishing communication. "However, weather conditions in the region are still too severe for flight operations. He estimates it will be at least 48 hours before he can safely attempt a rescue operation." Eleanor's post-storm meteorological analysis indicated that while the immediate storm had passed, the atmospheric conditions in the region remained highly unstable. Additional severe weather events were possible over the next several days, potentially complicating any rescue operations and prolonging their isolation. "The atmospheric patterns suggest continued instability for at least the next week," Elena reported. "We could experience additional severe weather events with relatively little warning. Any rescue operations will need to be planned around rapidly changing weather conditions." As the team assessed their situation and began planning for their continued survival until rescue could be accomplished, Sarah made a discovery that would prove to be both scientifically valuable and personally terrifying. Her analysis of the ice core samples they had collected before the storm revealed evidence of atmospheric conditions that provided crucial insights into the extreme weather they had just experienced. "The ice core data suggests that the storm we just survived was not an isolated event," Sarah reported during their evening briefing. "The atmospheric composition changes documented in these samples indicate that extreme weather events like this are becoming more frequent and severe in this region." Tommy's continued monitoring of polar bear activity in their area revealed that the animals were not moving away from their location as he had hoped. Instead, the bears appeared to be establishing the area around their camp as part of their regular territory, increasing the likelihood of dangerous encounters if the team remained in place for an extended period. "The bears are not moving on," Tommy announced grimly. "They have established this area as part of their territory, and they will continue to investigate our camp and equipment. The longer we remain here, the more likely it becomes that we will have a serious bear encounter." The 19th day of their expedition dawned with improved weather conditions, but with the continued presence of multiple polar bears in their immediate area. The team faced the difficult reality that they were effectively trapped between dangerous environmental conditions that prevented immediate rescue and wildlife threats that made any outdoor activities extremely hazardous. Dr. Mitchell's assessment of their situation was sobering but realistic. They had adequate supplies for several more days. Their communication equipment was functional enough to maintain contact with rescue services, and their shelters were providing adequate protection from both weather and wildlife. However, their situation remained precarious and could deteriorate rapidly if conditions changed. "We're in a survival situation, but we're managing it successfully so far," Mitchell announced during their morning briefing. "Our priority is to maintain our current status and avoid any actions that could increase our risk while we wait for rescue operations to become feasible." Sarah continued her analysis of their ice core data, finding that the scientific work they had accomplished before the crisis could provide valuable insights into the climate processes that had created their current dangerous situation. The irony was not lost on her that their research was documenting the very phenomena that were now threatening their survival. "Our data is showing that extreme weather events, like the storm we just survived, are becoming more frequent and intense in this region," she reported. "We're essentially documenting the climate changes that are making Arctic research increasingly dangerous." As the team settled into a routine of survival management while waiting for rescue, none of them could have predicted that their most dangerous challenge was still ahead of them. The polar bears that had been investigating their camp were about to demonstrate why they were considered the Arctic's apex predator, and the expedition team was about to face a crisis that would test their survival skills and determination to the absolute limit. The attack came at 13:47 hours on the 20th day of their expedition, during what had seemed like a routine equipment check outside their main shelter. Sarah had volunteered to assist Rebecca with an assessment of their emergency supply cache, a task that required venturing approximately 50 meters from their primary shelter to a storage area that had been established for their backup equipment and emergency supplies. The day had begun with what appeared to be improving conditions. The temperature had risen to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind had dropped to manageable levels, and visibility was excellent across the ice sheet. Tommy had conducted his morning perimeter check and reported no immediate signs of polar bear activity, though he cautioned that the animals could appear with little warning. "Conditions look good for limited outdoor activities," Tommy had announced during their morning briefing. "But we maintain full security protocols and work in pairs with constant communication. The bears are still in this area, and they can move very quickly across the ice." Sarah and Rebecca had followed all established safety protocols as they prepared for their supply assessment mission. They were equipped with radio communication devices, emergency signaling equipment, and bear deterrent devices including air horns and flare guns. Tommy had positioned himself as a lookout at the main shelter, maintaining visual contact with the two women as they worked. The supply cache assessment was proceeding normally when Rebecca noticed movement on the horizon, approximately 800 meters to the northeast. Using binoculars, she identified what appeared to be a large polar bear moving across the ice at a steady pace, but not in a direct approach toward their location. "Large bear at approximately 800 meters northeast," Rebecca reported calmly through her radio. "The bear appears to be traveling across our area rather than approaching directly." Continuing to monitor, Tommy acknowledged the report and confirmed the bear sighting from his observation position. The animal appeared to be an adult male, probably weighing 900 pounds or more, following what seemed to be an established travel route that would take it past their camp at a safe distance. "Confirmed on the bear sighting," Tommy replied. "Large male, traveling steady pace on a route that should take him past our position without direct approach. Continue your work, but maintain constant awareness." For several minutes, the situation remained stable. The polar bear continued on its apparent travel route, while Sarah and Rebecca completed their supply inventory with constant monitoring of the animal's position and behavior. Tommy maintained visual contact with both the bear and the two women, ready to provide immediate warning if the situation changed. The first indication that something was wrong came when Rebecca noticed that the bear had stopped moving and appeared to be testing the air with its nose raised. Polar bears have an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting scents from several miles away, and the animal's behavior suggested it had identified something of interest. "The bear has stopped and is scenting," Rebecca reported, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Distance approximately 600 meters and holding position. The bear appears to be investigating something, possibly our scent trail." Tommy immediately recognized the changed dynamics of their situation. A polar bear that had detected human scent and was investigating represented a significantly elevated threat level compared to an animal that was simply passing through the area. "Begin immediate return to main shelter," Tommy commanded through the radio. "Move at steady pace. Do not run. Maintain constant radio contact. I am tracking the bear's position and will provide updates." Sarah and Rebecca began their return journey to the main shelter, moving at a brisk but controlled pace, while maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. The supply cache was only 50 meters from their shelter, a distance that should have taken less than 2 minutes to cover under normal conditions. However, as they moved across the ice towards safety, Tommy's voice came through their radios with an urgency that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. "The bear is moving toward your position," Tommy announced, his voice tight with concern. "Speed increasing, direct approach, distance approximately 400 meters and closing. Move faster, but do not run. I am preparing deterrent measures." Sarah looked over her shoulder and saw the massive polar bear moving across the ice toward them with a purposeful lope that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. The animal was no longer following its original travel route, but was moving directly toward their position with the kind of focused intent that suggested it had identified them as objects of serious interest. "Bear closing distance rapidly," Rebecca reported as she increased their pace toward the shelter. "Approximately 300 meters and approaching fast. The bear is definitely targeting our position." Inside the main shelter, the rest of the expedition team was responding to Tommy's alert with practiced efficiency. Dr. Mitchell was preparing emergency communication equipment to alert rescue services, while David and Elena gathered their emergency bear encounter equipment. Dr. Weber and Dr. Hayes positioned themselves to assist with the evacuation of Sarah and Rebecca once they reached the shelter. Tommy had moved to an advanced position outside the shelter with the team's most powerful bear deterrent devices, including a high-powered air horn and military-grade flare gun. His experience with polar bear encounters had taught him that early deterrent action was often more effective than waiting until the animal came closer. "Deploying first deterrent," Tommy announced as he activated the air horn, sending a piercing blast of sound across the ice toward the approaching bear. The sound echoed across the landscape with startling intensity, but the polar bear's response was not what Tommy had hoped to see. Instead of being deterred by the loud noise, the bear briefly paused, then resumed its approach with what appeared to be increased determination. The animal's behavior suggested it was either extremely hungry or had become fixated on the human activity in a way that made it unwilling to be deterred by standard methods. "First deterrent ineffective," Tommy reported grimly. "Bear continuing approach, distance approximately 200 meters, deploying flare deterrent." The emergency flare created a brilliant burst of red light and smoke as it arced through the air toward the approaching polar bear. For a moment, it appeared that the visual deterrent might be effective as the bear slowed its approach and seemed to evaluate this new development. Sarah and Rebecca were now within 30 meters of the shelter entrance, close enough that they should have been able to reach safety before the bear could close the remaining distance. However, the polar bear's reaction to the flare would prove to be the critical moment that determined the outcome of their encounter. Instead of being deterred by the flare, the massive predator seemed to interpret it as a challenge or threat. With a burst of speed that demonstrated why polar bears were considered one of the most dangerous animals on Earth, the bear accelerated into a full charge directly towards Sarah and Rebecca's position. "Bear charging!" Tommy shouted into his radio as he prepared the team's final deterrent option. "Full charge! Closing fast!" "Get to the shelter immediately." Sarah and Rebecca broke into a run toward the shelter entrance, abandoning the controlled movement protocols in favor of reaching safety as quickly as possible. Behind them, the polar bear was covering ground with the kind of explosive speed that made it clear why these animals were successful predators in one of the world's harshest environments. The distance to the shelter entrance, which had seemed manageable just moments before, now felt like an impossible gap as Sarah heard the sound of the massive bear approaching behind them. Each footfall of the charging animal sent vibrations through the ice that she could feel through her boots, and she could hear the bear's powerful breathing as it closed the distance between them. Tommy fired his final flare directly at the charging bear, hoping to create enough confusion or intimidation to break the animal's charge before it reached the two women. The flare struck the ice just meters in front of the bear, creating another burst of light and smoke, but the massive predator was too committed to its charge to be deterred. Rebecca reached the shelter entrance first and dove through the opening, calling for Sarah to follow. Sarah was less than 5 meters behind her when she felt something catch her foot and send her sprawling face first onto the ice. In the chaos of the moment, she wasn't sure if she had tripped over a piece of equipment or an irregularity in the ice surface. As Sarah struggled to regain her footing, she looked back and saw the polar bear bearing down on her position with terrifying speed. The animal was now less than 10 meters away, close enough that she could see the details of its massive head and the determination in its dark eyes as it focused on her with predatory intensity. Tommy's final deterrent attempt was a direct shot, with a high-powered signal flare aimed at the bear's head and shoulders. The flare struck the animal, but seemed to have little effect other than adding to its apparent agitation. The bear was now too close and too committed to its charge to be stopped by any of their deterrent methods. "Sarah down! Bear closing!" Tommy shouted as he abandoned his deterrent efforts and sprinted toward her position, knowing that his only remaining option was direct physical intervention. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. As she tried to regain her footing on the ice, she felt the massive weight of the polar bear slam into her with a force that drove all the air from her lungs and sent her sliding across the ice surface. The impact was like being hit by a moving vehicle, and she immediately understood that she was in a fight for her survival against one of nature's most powerful predators. The polar bear's initial attack knocked Sarah approximately 8 feet across the ice surface, but the animal's momentum carried it past her position, giving her a brief moment to attempt to escape. However, as she tried to crawl toward the shelter, the bear quickly recovered and turned back toward her with the kind of focused aggression that made it clear the encounter was far from over. Tommy reached Sarah's position just as the polar bear turned back for its second attack. Drawing on decades of Arctic experience and survival training, he positioned himself between Sarah and the massive predator, armed with nothing more than a heavy ice axe and the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing someone's life depended on his actions. "Get to the shelter!" Tommy shouted to Sarah as he faced down the polar bear with his ice axe held defensively. The bear was now less than 6 feet away, close enough that Tommy could see the individual guard hairs around its massive head and smell the wild, musky scent of the animal's fur. The polar bear seemed to evaluate this new threat for a moment, its dark eyes shifting between Tommy and Sarah as it decided how to respond to the changed situation. The animal's body language suggested it was preparing for another charge, but this time it would have to go through Tommy to reach its original target. Inside the shelter, the rest of the expedition team was frantically preparing for emergency action while maintaining radio contact with rescue services. Dr. Mitchell was providing a real-time description of their situation to emergency coordinators, while Rebecca was gathering medical supplies in preparation for treating whatever injuries the encounter might produce. "We have a polar bear attack in progress," Mitchell reported into the emergency radio. "2 team members outside the shelter, bear actively engaged, immediate assistance required. Our position is 72 degrees 15 minutes north, 38 degrees 42 minutes west, requesting immediate emergency extraction." The response from emergency services was professional but sobering. Weather conditions in the region were still marginal for flight operations, and the nearest rescue aircraft was over an hour away, even under optimal conditions. The expedition team would have to manage this crisis with their own resources for at least the next several hours. Outside the shelter, the confrontation between Tommy and the polar bear was reaching a critical point. The massive predator seemed to be evaluating its options, shifting its weight from side to side as it prepared for another attack. Tommy held his position with the ice axe, knowing that his only chance was to make himself appear as threatening as possible, while hoping the bear would eventually lose interest and move away. Sarah, who had managed to crawl approximately 15 feet closer to the shelter entrance, was fighting through the pain and disorientation caused by the bear's initial impact. She could taste blood in her mouth and felt sharp pain in her left shoulder where the bear's weight had driven her into the ice, but she was still conscious and mobile. The polar bear's decision to attack again came without warning. The massive animal suddenly lunged forward with explosive speed, targeting Tommy's position with the kind of focused aggression that had made it the Arctic's apex predator for thousands of years. Tommy's response was born of pure instinct and survival training. As the bear charged, he swung the ice axe in a defensive arc, hoping to strike the animal's head or shoulders with enough force to deter its attack. The axe connected with the bear's massive skull, producing a solid impact that would have felled most other animals. However, polar bears are built to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and their skulls are designed to withstand tremendous impact forces. The axe blow that would have been devastating to most creatures seemed to do little more than anger the massive predator and intensify its determination to eliminate the threat Tommy represented. The bear's counterattack was swift and devastating. One massive paw caught Tommy across the chest, sending him flying backward across the ice surface with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs and send his ice axe spinning away into the distance. The impact left him stunned and temporarily unable to mount any further defense. With Tommy neutralized, the polar bear turned its attention back to Sarah, who was now crawling desperately toward the shelter entrance that seemed impossibly far away. The animal approached her with the kind of purposeful determination that suggested it had identified her as prey and would not be deterred from completing its attack. "Bear returning to Sarah's position!" Rebecca shouted from the shelter entrance as she witnessed the unfolding tragedy. "Tommy is down! Sarah is approximately 20 meters from shelter. Dr. Mitchell made the decision that would define his leadership throughout the crisis. Abandoning the safety of the shelter, he grabbed the expedition's emergency rifle and sprinted toward the polar bear encounter, knowing that direct intervention was Sarah's only chance for survival. The emergency rifle was a high-powered weapon specifically designed for polar bear encounters, loaded with ammunition capable of stopping even the largest Arctic predators. However, using the weapon effectively required getting close enough to ensure accurate shot placement while avoiding hitting the human victim in the process. As Mitchell approached the scene, he could see that Sarah was severely injured, but still conscious and attempting to escape. Tommy was beginning to recover from the bear's attack, but was too far away and too injured to provide immediate assistance. The polar bear was now standing directly over Sarah, and its body language suggested it was preparing to deliver a killing bite. "Emergency rifle deployment," Mitchell shouted into his radio as he closed the distance to the attack site. "All team members remain in shelter. Do not interfere with shot placement." The next few seconds would determine whether Sarah Bennett survived her encounter with one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. Mitchell knew he would have only one opportunity to stop the bear before it killed Sarah, and that opportunity would require him to make a precise shot under extreme pressure while managing his own fear and adrenaline. The polar bear seemed to sense the approaching threat and turned partially toward Mitchell's position, but its attention remained focused primarily on Sarah. The animal's massive head was less than 2 feet from Sarah's position, close enough that she could feel its breath on her face as it prepared for what appeared to be a final attack. Mitchell's shot came at the moment when the polar bear opened its massive jaws and began to lower its head toward Sarah's prone form. The high-powered rifle round struck the animal in the head with tremendous force, creating an impact that immediately changed the dynamics of the encounter. The effect of the rifle shot was dramatic and immediate. The massive polar bear staggered backward from Sarah's position, clearly wounded but not yet defeated. The animal's roar of pain and rage echoed across the ice sheet, with a sound that spoke to thousands of years of apex predator dominance in the Arctic environment. However, Mitchell's shot had not been immediately fatal, and the wounded bear remained extremely dangerous. Injured predators often became more aggressive rather than less, and the massive animal's response to being shot was to identify Mitchell as a new threat that needed to be eliminated. "Bear wounded, but still active," Mitchell reported into his radio as he worked the rifle's bolt action to chamber another round. "Targeting the new threat. Sarah is down, but appears to be conscious." The polar bear's charge toward Mitchell's position was weakened by its injury, but still represented a lethal threat. The massive animal moved with less coordination than before, but its size and remaining strength made it capable of killing anyone it could reach. Mitchell's second shot was aimed at the bear's chest cavity, targeting the animal's vital organs with the hope of stopping its charge before it could reach his position. The shot struck the bear with solid impact, causing it to stumble and lose some of its momentum, but the massive predator continued its approach. Tommy, who had recovered enough from his own encounter to rejoin the fight, retrieved his ice axe and moved to support Mitchell's position. Despite his injuries, his experience with Arctic wildlife made him a valuable ally in managing the wounded but still dangerous polar bear. "Third shot required," Mitchell announced as he chambered another round, while the wounded bear continued its weakened but still threatening approach. "Tommy is mobile and providing support." The third rifle shot finally achieved the result that the previous shots had been working toward. The high-powered round struck the polar bear in a vital area, causing the massive animal to collapse onto the ice surface approximately 10 feet from Mitchell's position. The immediate threat was finally ended, but the aftermath of the encounter would prove to be just the beginning of their crisis. Sarah Bennett lay motionless on the ice approximately 30 meters from the shelter entrance, her bright orange expedition clothing stained with blood and her body positioned in a way that suggested serious injuries. The initial impact from the polar bear's charge had caused obvious trauma, and she had been dragged across the rough ice surface during parts of the encounter. Tommy approached Sarah's position with medical supplies from the expedition's emergency kit, his own injuries from the bear encounter evident in his careful movements. His assessment of Sarah's condition would determine the urgency of their medical response and the priority level for emergency extraction. "Sarah is conscious but seriously injured," Tommy reported after his initial assessment. "Obvious trauma to left shoulder and arm, possible head injury, multiple lacerations from being dragged across ice surface. She is responsive but appears to be in significant pain." Dr. Mitchell established immediate radio contact with emergency medical services to report the attack and request priority medical evacuation. The information he provided would determine the level of emergency response and the speed with which rescue operations could be mobilized. "We have a confirmed polar bear attack with serious human injuries," Mitchell reported to emergency coordinators. "Victim is conscious but requires immediate medical evacuation. The bear has been neutralized, but we need emergency medical extraction as soon as possible." The response from emergency services was immediate and comprehensive. A medical evacuation helicopter was being prepared for departure despite marginal weather conditions, and emergency medical personnel were being briefed on the nature of Sarah's injuries and the remote location of the incident. Rebecca and Elena had emerged from the shelter with additional medical supplies and began providing immediate first aid to both Sarah and Tommy, while Dr. Mitchell coordinated with emergency services. The expedition's medical training was being put to the ultimate test as they worked to stabilize Sarah's condition until professional medical help could arrive. "Sarah is experiencing hypothermia in addition to her trauma injuries," Rebecca reported as she worked to insulate Sarah from the ice surface and begin rewarming procedures. "Core temperature is dropping rapidly due to shock and exposure. We need to get her warm and stable as quickly as possible." The process of moving Sarah from the attack site to the heated shelter required careful coordination to avoid worsening her injuries. The team members worked together to create an improvised stretcher that would allow them to transport her safely while maintaining immobilization of potentially injured areas. Tommy's own injuries from his encounter with the polar bear were significant but not immediately life-threatening. The impact from the bear's attack had resulted in bruised ribs and shoulder trauma, but he remained mobile and able to assist with Sarah's care. His experience and knowledge would prove crucial during the critical hours ahead. "Tommy has significant bruising and possible cracked ribs," Elena reported after conducting her assessment, but no signs of internal bleeding or other immediately serious injuries. He can continue to assist with operations, but should avoid heavy lifting or strenuous activity. Udi. Inside the heated shelter, the expedition team worked frantically to stabilize Sarah's condition while maintaining communication with emergency medical services. Her injuries were serious and would require professional medical treatment, but their immediate first aid efforts were helping to prevent further deterioration. "Sarah's vital signs are stabilizing," Dr. Hayes reported after completing a thorough medical assessment. "Blood pressure and heart rate are improving with warming and pain management. However, she definitely needs professional medical evaluation and treatment as soon as possible." The polar bear attack had transformed their scientific expedition into a medical emergency that would test every aspect of their training and preparation. The next several hours would be crucial for Sarah's survival and recovery, and would depend on their ability to maintain her condition until emergency medical evacuation could be accomplished. Dr. Mitchell's coordination with emergency services revealed that weather conditions were improving enough to allow helicopter operations, but the remote location and challenging landing conditions would make the evacuation operation complex and potentially dangerous for the rescue crew. "Emergency medical helicopter is en route," Mitchell announced to the team. "Estimated arrival time is 90 minutes, weather permitting. They will need us to prepare a landing zone and provide guidance for approach in these conditions." The process of preparing a helicopter landing zone on the ice sheet required the team members to venture back outside their shelter, despite the psychological trauma of the recent polar bear attack. Tommy and Dr. Webber volunteered for this critical task, using their combined experience to select and prepare the safest possible landing area. Landing zone prepared approximately 100 meters southeast of main shelter, Tommy reported after completing the site preparation. Ice surface is solid and level, adequate clearance for helicopter operations. We have emergency signaling devices positioned to guide approach. As the team waited for the arrival of emergency medical evacuation, Sarah's condition remained stable but serious. She was conscious and responsive, but clearly experiencing significant pain from her injuries and the psychological trauma of surviving a polar bear attack. "The attack happened so fast," Sarah managed to say during one of her lucid moments. "1 second I was working on the supply inventory, and the next second I was fighting for my life against a polar bear. If Tommy and Dr. Mitchell hadn't intervened, I wouldn't have survived." Elena continued her meteorological monitoring to ensure that weather conditions would remain suitable for helicopter operations during the critical evacuation window. The atmospheric data indicated stable conditions for at least the next 4 hours, providing adequate time for the rescue operation. "Weather conditions are favorable for helicopter operations," Elena reported. "Wind speeds are below operational limits, visibility is excellent, and no significant weather changes are expected during the evacuation timeframe." The sound of the approaching medical evacuation helicopter was audible across the ice sheet long before the aircraft became visible, providing a psychological boost to the expedition team and confirmation that professional medical help was finally arriving. The distinctive sound of rotor blades echoing across the Arctic landscape represented hope and salvation after hours of crisis management. "Medical evacuation helicopter in sight," Dr. Webber announced from his position at the landing zone. "Aircraft is approaching from the southeast, following our guidance signals. Estimated touchdown in 5 minutes." The helicopter crew's approach to the improvised landing zone demonstrated the kind of professional skill that made Arctic rescue operations possible under challenging conditions. The pilots had to navigate wind patterns and ice conditions, while managing the complex logistics of landing a medical evacuation aircraft in one of the most remote locations on Earth. "Helicopter touchdown confirmed," Webber reported as the aircraft settled onto the prepared landing zone. "Medical team is disembarking and approaching our position with emergency equipment." The arrival of the professional medical team immediately changed the level of care that Sarah could receive. The emergency medical technicians were experienced in treating trauma injuries under extreme conditions and brought sophisticated medical equipment that was not available to the expedition team. Patient assessment indicates serious but not immediately life-threatening injuries, the lead medical technician announced after conducting his evaluation of Sarah's condition. Shoulder and arm trauma, possible concussion, multiple lacerations, and mild hypothermia. Patient is stable for transport. The process of loading Sarah into the medical evacuation helicopter was conducted with meticulous care to avoid worsening her injuries during transport. The medical team used specialized equipment to immobilize potentially injured areas and ensure her stability during the flight to medical facilities. Tommy insisted on accompanying Sarah during the medical evacuation, both to provide information about the attack and to receive his own medical evaluation for the injuries he had sustained during his encounter with the polar bear. His presence would also provide psychological support for Sarah during the stressful evacuation process. "Tommy is accompanying the patient for medical evaluation and support," the medical team leader announced. "His injuries appear non-critical, but he should receive full medical assessment given the nature of the incident." As the medical evacuation helicopter departed with Sarah and Tommy aboard, The remaining expedition team members faced the reality that their research mission had been fundamentally altered by the polar bear attack. The psychological trauma of the incident, combined with the continued presence of polar bears in their area, made it clear that continuing their research activities would be extremely difficult. Dr. Mitchell immediately began coordination with Expedition Support Services to arrange for the evacuation of the remaining team members and the termination of their research mission. The valuable scientific data they had collected would be preserved and analyzed, but the safety risks had become unacceptable for continued operations. Research mission is being terminated due to safety concerns, Mitchell announced during his communication with expedition coordinators. Team extraction will be arranged as soon as aircraft availability and weather conditions permit. All scientific data and samples will be preserved for analysis. The polar bear attack had lasted less than 10 minutes from first sighting to final resolution, but its impact on the expedition team would be long-lasting and profound. Sarah's physical injuries would heal over time, but the psychological trauma of surviving an encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators would affect her for the rest of her life. Elena continued her documentation of the incident for the official reports that would be required by various agencies and organizations. The detailed records of weather conditions, wildlife activity, and the sequence of events leading to the attack would be valuable for improving safety protocols for future Arctic research expeditions. Complete incident documentation is being prepared for wildlife authorities, research institutions, and safety review boards, Elena reported. The data we collected may help improve safety protocols and bear encounter procedures for future expeditions. Dr. Weber and David worked together to secure and prepare their scientific equipment and data for transport during the upcoming team evacuation. The research they had accomplished before the crisis would provide valuable insights into Arctic climate dynamics, despite the premature termination of their expedition. Scientific data collection has been secured and prepared for transport, Weber announced. The ice core samples and radar data we collected will provide significant insights into Arctic climate processes, and the research objectives have been largely accomplished despite the early termination. Rebecca conducted a comprehensive inventory of their supplies and equipment to ensure that nothing essential was left behind during the evacuation process. Her meticulous attention to detail had helped keep the team alive during their crisis and would ensure a safe and organized departure from their remote research site. Equipment and supply inventory is complete, Rebecca reported. All essential items are accounted for and prepared for evacuation transport. Emergency supplies have been consolidated for potential use during evacuation delays. Dr. Hayes had been quietly processing the psychological impact of witnessing the polar bear attack and its aftermath. As a researcher who had spent years studying Arctic marine ecosystems, she understood the important role that polar bears played in the Arctic environment, but seeing the animals' predatory power demonstrated so dramatically had been profoundly disturbing. The attack was a reminder of how quickly conditions can change in the Arctic, Hayes observed during one of their post-incident discussions. We train for these situations, but experiencing the reality of a polar bear encounter is completely different from any simulation or theoretical preparation. The team's extraction was accomplished the following day, when weather conditions permitted the return of their pilot, Marcus Hendrickson, with additional aircraft support for moving their equipment and scientific samples. The evacuation process was conducted with heightened security protocols to prevent any additional wildlife encounters. Team extraction completed successfully, Hendrickson reported, as the final loads of equipment and personnel were transported away from the research site. All team members and essential equipment have been safely evacuated. The research site is being abandoned according to environmental protection protocols. Sarah's medical treatment at the regional medical facility confirmed that her injuries, while serious, were not permanently disabling. The trauma to her shoulder and arm would require surgery and extensive physical therapy, but full recovery was expected within 6 to 8 months with proper medical care. Patient prognosis is good for full recovery, her attending physician announced after completing his evaluation. The shoulder injuries will require surgical repair and extended rehabilitation, but no permanent disability is expected. The psychological trauma may require longer-term counseling and support. Tommy's medical evaluation revealed that his injuries from the polar bear encounter were less severe than initially feared. The massive impact that had knocked him across the ice had resulted in bruised ribs and soft tissue trauma, but no permanent damage or life-threatening injuries. Tommy's injuries are painful but not serious, the medical team reported. Bruised ribs and muscle trauma will heal with rest and pain management. His quick thinking and brave actions during the attack undoubtedly saved Sarah's life. The official investigation of the polar bear attack would be conducted by multiple agencies, including wildlife authorities, research safety organizations, and Arctic expedition oversight bodies. The incident would be thoroughly analyzed to identify any factors that could be addressed to prevent similar attacks in the future. Investigation teams are being assembled to conduct comprehensive analysis of the incident, the lead investigator announced. All aspects of the encounter will be examined, including wildlife behavior, safety protocols, environmental conditions, and response procedures. Dr. Mitchell's leadership during the crisis had been exemplary, demonstrating the kind of calm decision-making and effective coordination that distinguished experienced expedition leaders. His actions had undoubtedly minimized the severity of the incident and ensured the survival of all team members. Dr. Mitchell's leadership during the crisis was outstanding, Expedition Support Services reported. His quick decisions and effective coordination of emergency response procedures were crucial factors in the successful resolution of a potentially fatal situation. The scientific data collected by the expedition team before the polar bear attack would prove to be extremely valuable for understanding Arctic climate dynamics and ice sheet behavior. Despite the premature termination of their research mission, they had accomplished most of their scientific objectives and collected unprecedented data about climate change processes. The scientific results from this expedition will provide significant contributions to Arctic climate research, the Research Review Board announced. The ice core samples and environmental data collected will be analyzed by multiple institutions and will advance our understanding of Arctic climate change processes. Elena's meteorological data from the expedition documented weather conditions that were unprecedented in terms of intensity and variability. Her measurements would contribute to improved weather forecasting models for Arctic regions and better understanding of how climate change was affecting Arctic weather patterns. The meteorological data collected during this expedition documents extreme weather events that exceed previous records for this region, Elena reported in her preliminary analysis. The atmospheric conditions we measured provide valuable insights into how climate change is affecting Arctic weather patterns. David's radar mapping of subsurface ice structures had revealed ice sheet dynamics that were happening much faster than previous research had indicated was possible. His data would contribute to improved understanding of how ice sheets respond to changing environmental conditions. The radar data from this expedition shows ice sheet movement and adaptation processes occurring at rates that exceed current scientific models, David reported. The subsurface structural changes we documented suggest that ice sheets can respond to environmental changes much more rapidly than previously understood. The polar bear attack that ended their expedition had been a dramatic demonstration of the increasing challenges faced by Arctic researchers as climate change altered the behavior and distribution patterns of Arctic wildlife. Polar bears were being forced to travel longer distances and explore new areas as their traditional hunting grounds changed. The polar bear encounter we experienced may be representative of increasing human-wildlife conflicts as climate change forces both humans and animals to adapt to changing Arctic conditions, wildlife experts observed. As sea ice patterns change and research activities expand, the likelihood of such encounters may increase. Sarah's recovery process would be long and challenging, involving not only physical rehabilitation from her injuries, but also psychological counseling to help her process the trauma of surviving a polar bear attack. However, her determination to continue her research career suggested that the incident, while life-changing, would not end her contribution to Arctic science. "I'm determined to return to Arctic research once I've recovered," Sarah announced during one of her hospital interviews. "This experience has given me a deeper understanding of the challenges and risks involved in Arctic work, but it has also reinforced my commitment to studying climate change processes. The data we collected during this expedition could be crucial for understanding how rapidly the Arctic is changing." Tommy's reputation as an Arctic guide was enhanced rather than damaged by his actions during the polar bear attack. His willingness to risk his own life to protect a team member had demonstrated the kind of courage and commitment that made him one of the most respected guides in the Arctic research community. Tommy's actions during the bear attack exemplified the highest standards of Arctic guiding and demonstrated why experienced local guides are essential for safe Arctic research operations, expedition safety reviewers concluded. His knowledge and quick thinking were crucial factors in preventing a fatal outcome. Dr. Mitchell continued to lead Arctic research expeditions, using the lessons learned from the polar bear incident to improve safety protocols and emergency response procedures. His experience during the crisis had provided valuable insights that would benefit future research teams operating in challenging Arctic conditions. The polar bear incident taught us important lessons about Arctic research safety that will be incorporated into our training and operational procedures, Mitchell announced during his post-expedition briefing. "While we cannot eliminate all risks in Arctic research, we can continue to improve our preparation and response capabilities." The scientific community's response to the expedition's research results was overwhelmingly positive, despite the dramatic circumstances that had ended their fieldwork. The data they had collected provided unprecedented insights into Arctic climate processes and would influence research priorities and methodologies for years to come. This expedition's research results represent a significant advancement in our understanding of Arctic climate dynamics, the International Arctic Research Council announced. The ice core data, meteorological measurements, and ice sheet mapping provide valuable contributions to climate change research, despite the challenging circumstances the team faced. Rebecca's role as Field Operations Coordinator had been crucial during both the normal research activities and the emergency response to the polar bear attack. Her meticulous attention to supply management and safety protocols had helped ensure the team's survival during their crisis. Rebecca's logistical management and emergency preparedness were essential factors in the successful outcome of this expedition, expedition reviewers noted. Her attention to detail and crisis management skills demonstrated the critical importance of experienced operations coordinators for Arctic research missions. Dr. Weber's geological analysis of their ice core samples revealed climate change processes that were occurring at rates that exceeded most current scientific predictions. His findings would contribute to updated climate models and improved understanding of how rapidly Arctic conditions could change. The geological data from this expedition documents climate change processes occurring at unprecedented rates, Weber reported in his preliminary findings. The ice formation and structural changes we observed suggest that Arctic climate systems are responding to global warming much more rapidly than current models predict. Dr. Hayes's research on Arctic marine ecosystem changes had been limited by the early termination of their expedition, but the data she had collected provided valuable insights into how ice sheet changes were affecting marine life in Arctic waters. The marine ecosystem data we collected documents significant changes in Arctic Ocean conditions that are affecting the entire marine food web, Hayes reported. These changes are directly related to the ice sheet dynamics and climate processes that the rest of our team was studying. The media coverage of the polar bear attack brought international attention to both the dangers faced by Arctic researchers and the important scientific work they were conducting. The incident highlighted the increasing challenges of conducting research in rapidly changing Arctic conditions. The polar bear attack in Greenland demonstrates the increasing risks faced by scientists studying climate change in the Arctic, major news outlets reported. The incident also highlights the crucial importance of Arctic research for understanding global climate change processes. The long-term impact of the expedition extended far beyond the immediate research results and the dramatic polar bear encounter. The team's experience had provided valuable lessons about Arctic research safety, climate change processes, and the complex relationships between human activities and Arctic wildlife. This expedition will be remembered not only for its scientific contributions, but also for the lessons it taught about conducting research in rapidly changing Arctic conditions, Arctic research historians would later observe. The team's experience represents both the opportunities and challenges of Arctic climate research in an era of unprecedented environmental change. Sarah Bennett's name would become associated with both groundbreaking Arctic research and survival against overwhelming odds. Her determination to continue her research career despite the trauma of the polar bear attack would inspire a new generation of Arctic researchers and demonstrate the commitment required to understand and address global climate change. Years later, as Sarah stood once again on Arctic ice conducting research, she would remember the lessons learned during those terrifying moments when she faced one of nature's most powerful predators. The experience had changed her understanding of the Arctic environment and reinforced her commitment to studying the climate processes that were reshaping the planet. The data collected during that expedition continued to influence Arctic research and climate change understanding, ensuring that the team's sacrifice and courage had contributed to humanity's knowledge of our changing world. The polar bear that had attacked Sarah Bennett represented both the raw power of Arctic wildlife and the complex challenges facing Arctic ecosystems as climate change altered their traditional environments. The incident served as a dramatic reminder that Arctic research involved real risks and required constant respect for the power and unpredictability of one of Earth's most challenging environments. The next stories. The Last Nail. The morning mist clung to Kachemak Bay like a shroud, and Richard Ellis should have recognized it as an omen. Instead, he stood on the rocky shoreline of his property near Old Harbor, Alaska, breathing in the salt-tinged air and feeling nothing but satisfaction. At 58, the grizzled carpenter from Anchorage had finally scraped together enough money to buy his dream. 40 acres of pristine wilderness on the southern tip of Kodiak Island, where he planned to build the cabin that would serve as his retirement sanctuary. Richard had been planning this moment for 3 decades. Every overtime shift at the construction company, every weekend spent building decks and additions for wealthy Anchorage residents. Every penny saved from his modest paycheck had been building toward this dream. The land had cost him $60,000, nearly his entire life savings, but it was worth it. Here, surrounded by towering Sitka spruce and the vast expanse of the North Pacific, he would build something that would last long after he was gone. The property stretched from the rocky coastline inland for nearly half a mile, encompassing a gentle slope that rose toward the foothills of the island's interior mountains. Richard had chosen the building site carefully, a natural clearing about 300 yards from the water, positioned to catch the morning sun while being sheltered from the worst of the coastal winds by a stand of ancient spruce trees. A small creek meandered through the eastern edge of the property, providing fresh water year-round. Richard's wife, Margaret, had died 4 years earlier from cancer, and their only child, Sarah, lived in Seattle with her own family. She visited when she could, but Richard understood that she had her own life to live. This cabin would be his legacy to her, a place where his grandchildren could learn to fish and hunt and appreciate the wild places that were disappearing so rapidly from the world. The cabin design was Richard's own creation, refined over years of sketching and planning. It would be a substantial structure, 24 feet by 36 feet, with a steep metal roof to shed the heavy Kodiak snows. The foundation would be built on concrete piers to keep the structure off the permeable ground, and the walls would be solid log construction using local timber. Richard had already arranged for a portable sawmill to be brought to the site, allowing him to mill his own lumber from trees cleared during construction. The plan was ambitious for a man working alone, but Richard had enlisted help for the heavy work. His nephew Jake Morrison, a burly 28-year-old who worked as a fishing guide in Homer, had agreed to spend 2 weeks helping with the foundation and framing. Jake's girlfriend, Amanda Chen, a nurse practitioner from Soldotna, would join them for the second week, bringing her medical training and her considerable skills with a chainsaw. She had grown up on her family's timber farm in Oregon. Joining them would be Tom Kozloff, Richard's longtime friend and former construction partner. At 62, Tom was supposedly retired, but he couldn't resist the chance to build one more cabin in the wilderness. Tom's wife, Susan, had agreed to come along to cook for the crew and help with the countless small tasks that such a project required. Their daughter, Lisa, a wildlife biology graduate student at the University of Alaska, would join them for a few days to document the local ecosystem before construction began. The team was rounded out by Brad Hoffman, a local helicopter pilot who would ferry supplies from Old Harbor, and his mechanic, Carlos Mendez, who had grown up in the area and knew the island better than almost anyone. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a friend of Amanda's who practiced emergency medicine in Anchorage, had also volunteered to join the group for a working vacation, bringing her medical expertise and her enthusiasm for wilderness construction projects. Richard had spent months planning the logistics. The materials would arrive by barge from Kodiak town: lumber, concrete, roofing materials, windows, and all the countless hardware items needed for construction. A generator would provide power, and they would live in tents during the construction phase. The work would be hard, but Richard was confident that with good weather and willing hands, they could have the shell of the cabin completed in 3 weeks. What Richard didn't know, as he stood on the shoreline that crisp morning in late November, was that his 40 acres were part of the territory of a massive male Kodiak bear known to locals as Ghost. The bear had earned his name from his unusually light-colored coat and his ability to move through the forest without making a sound. At 12 years old, Ghost weighed nearly 1,200 pounds and stood over 4 feet tall at the shoulder. He was one of the largest bears on the island, and he was fiercely territorial. Ghost had been born in the forest just inland from Richard's property. His mother had denned in a cave in the rocky outcropping that formed the property's eastern boundary, and Ghost had spent his first months of life learning to hunt and forage in the berry patches and salmon streams that dotted the area. When he reached maturity and drove off his mother and siblings, Ghost had claimed this territory as his own, defending it against other bears and marking the boundaries with claw marks on trees and scent markings on rocks. The bear's territory encompassed nearly 20 square miles, but the heart of it was the area around Richard's building site. Ghost had made his winter den in a hollow beneath the roots of a massive fallen spruce tree less than a quarter-mile from where Richard planned to build his cabin. The den was perfectly concealed by a tangle of fallen logs and dense undergrowth, but Ghost could emerge from it and reach the building site in minutes. Richard's first mistake was not hiring a local guide to survey the property for bear sign before beginning construction. His second mistake was choosing a building site that was directly upwind from Ghost's den. His third and most fatal mistake was storing food in his tent instead of in bear-proof containers suspended high in the trees. The construction team began arriving on November 15th. Tom and Susan Kozlov came in on the morning ferry from Kodiak Town, bringing with them a truck loaded with tools and camping gear. They set up their tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the building site, close enough to be convenient, but far enough to provide some privacy. Jake Morrison and Amanda Chen arrived the next day by float plane, along with 3 tons of lumber and hardware. Jake immediately began surveying the building site with Richard, using a transit to lay out the exact position of the foundation piers. Amanda, meanwhile, unpacked her medical supplies and set up a first aid station in the largest tent. As a nurse practitioner, she knew that even minor injuries could become serious problems when you were hours away from the nearest hospital. "You sure picked a beautiful spot, Uncle Rick," Jake said as they finished marking the foundation layout. "But you know this is serious bear country, right? I saw some tracks down by the creek that looked pretty fresh." Richard nodded, but wasn't particularly concerned. He had lived in Alaska for 30 years and had encountered bears before. "We'll keep a clean camp and make plenty of noise when we're working," he said. "Bears usually avoid people if you give them a chance." Lisa Kozlov arrived on the 3rd day, eager to begin her wildlife survey. As a graduate student in wildlife biology, she was fascinated by the opportunity to document the ecosystem before construction began. She spent her first day hiking the property boundaries, photographing plants and animals, and noting signs of wildlife activity. Her findings should have been a warning to the group. "There's a lot of bear activity here," she told her parents over dinner that evening. "I found scat in at least a dozen locations, and some of the claw marks on the trees are really high up. There's definitely a very large bear using this area regularly." "How large?" Amanda asked, looking up from the wound she was cleaning on Jake's hand. He had scraped it on a rough piece of lumber earlier in the day. "Based on the size of the tracks and the height of the claw marks, I'd estimate at least 800 pounds, possibly larger. And the scat is fresh, within the last few days. This bear is still actively using this territory." Tom looked thoughtful. "Maybe we should check with some of the locals in Old Harbor, see if they know anything about a particularly large bear in this area." Richard waved off the concern. "I'm sure it's just passing through. Bears this time of year are getting ready to den up for the winter. Once the weather turns cold, we won't see hide nor hair of it." Richard's confidence was understandable, but misplaced. November was indeed the time when most Kodiak bears entered their winter dens, but Ghost was an exception. As one of the largest and most dominant bears on the island, he often remained active well into December, taking advantage of his size to drive smaller bears away from the best food sources. He had learned that humans sometimes left food scraps behind, and he had developed a dangerous association between human presence and easy meals. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived on the 4th day, flying in with Carlos Mendez in Brad Hoffman's helicopter. Jennifer brought with her a satellite phone and additional medical supplies, as well as an infectious enthusiasm for the project. As an emergency room physician, she was accustomed to working long hours under pressure, and she threw herself into the construction work with surprising skill. Carlos, meanwhile, proved invaluable for his knowledge of the local area. He had grown up in Old Harbor and had been hunting and fishing on Kodiak Island his entire life. When he saw Lisa's photographs of the bear sign, his expression grew serious. "This looks like the sign of the bear we call Ghost," he said, studying a photograph of claw marks on a large spruce tree. "He's been around this area for years. Most of the time he stays away from people, but he's not afraid of them either, and he's huge, probably the biggest bear on this part of the island." "Have you seen him recently?" Richard asked. "Not this fall, but my cousin spotted him last month near the Salmon Run, about 2 miles north of here. He was fishing, but when Miguel got too close, the bear just stood up and looked at him. Miguel said it was like looking at a truck standing on its hind legs." Amanda frowned. "Maybe we should reconsider the food storage arrangements. I noticed you've been keeping everything in your tent, Richard." "I've got bear spray," Richard replied, "and we're making plenty of noise during the day. If there was a bear around, it would have shown itself by now." This assumption would prove tragically wrong. Ghost had indeed detected the presence of humans on his territory from the moment the first tent was erected. His powerful nose could detect scent trails from miles away, and he had been carefully observing the construction site from concealment in the dense forest that surrounded the clearing. The bear's intelligence was formidable. He had learned to remain downwind of humans and to move only during the hours when they were sleeping or when the wind and their own activities would mask the sound of his approach. For the past 4 days, Ghost had been conducting reconnaissance of the human encampment. He had circled the site multiple times during the night, cataloguing the scents and sounds and learning the routines of the occupants. He had discovered that Richard kept food in his tent, and he had noted the location of each tent and the positions where the humans posted lookouts during their work. The bear's behavior was being driven by several factors. First, the humans had established their camp directly in the center of his territory, near resources that he considered his own. Second, the approach of winter meant that Ghost needed to maximize his caloric intake before entering his den. Third, and most dangerously, Ghost had learned that humans often possessed concentrated sources of food that were easier to obtain than the scattered berries and salmon that made up his normal diet. The construction work proceeded smoothly for the first week. The foundation piers were poured and allowed to cure, and the team began cutting and notching logs for the walls. Richard was in his element, directing the work with the confidence of a master craftsman. The framework of the cabin began to take shape, and Richard's dream seemed to be becoming reality. The weather was unusually mild for late November, with daytime temperatures reaching into the low 40s and nighttime lows hovering just above freezing. The lack of snow made the work easier, but it also meant that Ghost remained active when he might normally have begun his winter sleep. On November 22nd, the team celebrated the completion of the foundation with a feast cooked by Susan Kozloff. She had brought ingredients for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, and the group gathered around a campfire to share stories and enjoy the meal. The mood was festive, and Richard felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he looked at the concrete piers that would support his dream cabin. "You know what?" he said, raising a cup of coffee and a toast. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished so far. This is going to be something special." The group raised their cups in response, and Amanda took photographs to document the moment. None of them noticed the pale shape moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, or the pair of dark eyes watching them from the shadows. Ghost had been drawn to the camp by the smell of cooking food. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce. The rich scents were unlike anything in the bear's normal experience, and they triggered an intense curiosity. The bear remained hidden until long after the humans had retired to their tents, then emerged to investigate the campfire area. He found scraps of food in the fire pit and around the improvised dining area. The tastes were strange but appealing, and Ghost spent several hours exploring the camp, carefully avoiding the tents where the humans slept. By morning, he had retreated to his den, but the experience had reinforced his association between humans and food. Lisa noticed the tracks the next morning. "Someone needs to look at this," she called, standing near the dead campfire. The rest of the team gathered around to examine the clear imprints in the soft earth. "Holy hell," Jake whispered. "Look at the size of those paws." The tracks were massive, nearly a foot long and 8 inches wide. They formed a clear trail around the campsite, showing where the bear had investigated every area where food had been prepared or consumed. Carlos knelt beside the tracks, studying them carefully. "This is definitely Ghost," he said. "See how the claws are really spread out? That's his signature. And look here, he spent a lot of time right where you were cooking dinner." Amanda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How close did he get to the tents?" "Close," Carlos replied, pointing to a track just 10 feet from where Richard had been sleeping. "If he had wanted to, he could have walked right up to any of you." Richard examined the tracks, but remained optimistic. "Well, he didn't bother us, did he? Probably just curious about the smell of cooking. We'll be more careful about cleaning up." Dr. Walsh was less sanguine. "Richard, I think we need to have a serious discussion about safety protocols. This bear clearly isn't afraid of humans, and the fact that he came into camp while we were sleeping is extremely concerning." "What do you suggest?" Richard asked. "First, all food needs to be stored in bear-proof containers and suspended at least 12 feet off the ground. Second, we need to establish a watch schedule. Someone should be awake and alert at all times. Third, everyone needs to carry bear spray and know how to use it." Richard was reluctant to implement such stringent measures. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but we can't let fear paralyze us. We're here to build a cabin, not to cower in our tents." Tom Kozlov, however, sided with Jennifer. "Rick, I've been building in bear country for 40 years, and I've never seen tracks like these in a campsite. This animal isn't showing normal avoidance behavior." After considerable discussion, the group agreed to implement modified safety protocols. Food would be stored in sealed containers and hung from cables strung between trees. They would clean cooking areas thoroughly after each meal and avoid eating in or near the tents. However, Richard vetoed the idea of posting guards, arguing that the sound of construction work during the day would keep any bears at a safe distance. The compromise would prove fatally inadequate. Construction resumed on November 24th with renewed energy. The first course of logs was laid on the foundation, and the walls began to rise. Richard worked alongside Jake and Tom, notching each log by hand and ensuring that the joints were tight and square. Amanda and Jennifer proved surprisingly skilled with chainsaws, cutting logs to length and stripping bark. Susan and Lisa documented the progress with photographs and handled the countless small tasks that kept the project moving forward. The work was hard but satisfying. Each day brought visible progress, and Richard began to see his dream cabin taking solid form. By the end of the week, the walls were chest-high, and the structure was beginning to dominate the clearing. What Richard didn't realize was that the construction activity was having an unintended effect on Ghost. The sounds of chainsaws, hammering, and human voices were not driving the bear away, as Richard had assumed. Instead, they were serving as a dinner bell, alerting Ghost to the presence of the humans who had become associated in his mind with easy food. Each night, after the construction crew had retired to their tents, Ghost would emerge from his den and patrol the edges of the clearing. He had learned the humans' schedule, They typically stopped work around 6 in the evening, ate dinner around 7, and were asleep by 10. The bear would wait until midnight or later before beginning his reconnaissance, using his exceptional night vision to observe the camp from multiple angles. Ghost was learning. He had identified which tent belonged to which human based on scent trails and movement patterns. He knew where the food was stored and had tested the cables and containers, finding them frustratingly secure. Most importantly, he had identified Richard as the alpha of the group, the human who gave orders and made decisions. In the bear's hierarchy-based understanding of the world, Richard was both the primary threat and the primary target. The bear's stalking behavior escalated throughout the week. On Tuesday night, he approached to within 20 feet of Jake and Amanda's tent. On Wednesday, he spent 2 hours circling the camp, occasionally standing on his hind legs to peer over obstacles and get a better view of the humans. On Thursday, he tested the guy lines of Susan and Tom's tent, pushing against them just hard enough to make the fabric flutter. None of these nocturnal visits were detected by the sleeping humans. Ghost moved with the absolute silence that had earned him his name, and his pale coat made him nearly invisible in the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. By Friday, November 29th, Ghost had made his decision. The humans represented both an opportunity and a threat. They were a source of food, but they were also invaders in his territory. His response would be swift, decisive, and devastating. Richard woke before dawn on November 29th, feeling unusually restless. He lay in his sleeping bag for several minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through the spruce trees, the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore, the occasional call of a night bird. Something felt different, though he couldn't quite identify what. He checked his watch. 5:30 a.m. The sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours, but Richard was wide awake. He dressed quietly and slipped out of his tent, intending to start the coffee and perhaps review the day's construction plans by lamplight. The morning air was crisp and still, with a clarity that promised a beautiful day for construction. Richard walked to the cook area and began setting up the camp stove, moving by the light of a battery-powered lantern. He was looking forward to the day's work. They planned to install the door and window frames, major milestones in the cabin's construction. As he worked, Richard was unaware that he was being watched. Ghost lay concealed in a thicket of devil's club just 30 yards away, his massive form motionless as a boulder. The bear had been in position for over an hour, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The attack, when it came, was swift and silent. Richard was bending over the camp stove, adjusting the flame under the coffee pot, when Ghost exploded from the undergrowth. The bear moved with shocking speed for such a large animal, covering 30 yards in less than 3 seconds. Richard heard a sound like a freight train approaching and turned just in time to see 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury bearing down on him. He had no time to reach for bear spray, no time to shout a warning, no time to run. Ghost struck him with the force of a speeding truck, his massive paws driving Richard to the ground with bone-crushing impact. The bear's claws, each longer than a man's finger, ripped through Richard's jacket and into the flesh beneath. Richard's scream shattered the morning stillness, jolting the other campers awake. In their tents, Jake and Amanda sat up in confusion, trying to process the horrific sounds coming from the cook area. Tom and Susan Kozloff were on their feet instantly, Tom grabbing a flashlight and bear spray, while Susan reached for the satellite phone. "Richard!" Tom shouted, running toward the sounds of the attack. His light beam caught the scene, Richard on the ground, the massive pale form of Ghost standing over him, blood already darkening the earth. Ghost looked up at Tom's approach, his small dark eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. For a moment, bear and man stared at each other across 20 feet of open ground. Then Ghost's attention returned to Richard, who was trying desperately to crawl away despite his massive injuries. Tom fumbled with the bear spray, his hands shaking as he tried to remove the safety cap. "Get away from him," he shouted, his voice cracking with terror and adrenaline. The bear ignored him completely. Ghost seized Richard by the shoulder and shook him like a dog shaking a rat. The sound of breaking bones was audible even over Richard's screams. Tom finally managed to deploy the bear spray, sending an orange cloud of capsaicin toward the bear. But the mild morning breeze carried most of it away. Jake Morrison burst from his tent, carrying a .45 caliber pistol, Amanda close behind him with her medical kit. "Where is it?" Jake shouted, trying to locate the bear in the chaos and darkness. "There!" Tom pointed with his flashlight. "It's on Richard!" Jake raised the pistol, but hesitated. In the poor light and confusion, he couldn't be certain of hitting the bear without risking Richard. Ghost had dragged Richard several feet from where the attack began, and the two forms were intertwined in a deadly embrace. Amanda reached Tom's position and immediately began setting up her medical supplies. "We need to drive it off now," she shouted. "He's losing too much blood." Ghost seemed to realize that other humans were approaching. The bear released Richard and stood to his full height, presenting a terrifying silhouette against the dark forest. Standing on his hind legs, Ghost was nearly 9 feet tall, his massive shoulders broader than a man's outstretched arms. Jake fired twice, the gunshots echoing off the surrounding hills. Both shots struck Ghost in the chest, but the bear's thick hide and layers of fat absorbed most of the impact. Ghost dropped to all fours and let out a roar that seemed to shake the ground, then charged directly at Jake. Jake fired 3 more times as the bear closed the distance. At least one shot hit Ghost in the shoulder, spinning him partially around, but failing to stop his charge. Jake dove sideways, narrowly avoiding the bear's swipe, and rolled behind a stack of lumber. Ghost's attention was now divided between the wounded Richard and the other humans who were threatening him. The bear's predatory instincts told him to drag his prey to safety, but his territorial nature demanded that he drive off the intruders. For several crucial seconds, Ghost stood in the middle of the clearing, bellowing his rage and confusion. Amanda used the brief respite to reach Richard's side. What she saw made her stomach clench with horror. Richard's left arm was nearly severed at the shoulder, hanging by tendons and strips of muscle. His chest and abdomen were laid open by massive claw wounds, and blood was pooling beneath him in alarming quantities. "Richard, can you hear me?" Amanda pressed her hands against the worst of the bleeding, trying to stem the flow. Richard's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing rapid and shallow. He was going into shock. "Amanda, get away from him!" Jake shouted from behind the lumber pile. "The bear's coming back!" Ghost had indeed decided to reclaim his prize. The bear advanced toward Amanda and Richard, moving more slowly now, but with deadly purpose. Amanda looked up to see death approaching on 4 legs, and for a moment her training deserted her. She was face to face with a nightmare, a creature from humanity's deepest fears. Then her medical training reasserted itself. Richard was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. Amanda pulled out her own canister of bear spray and waited until Ghost was less than 10 feet away before deploying it directly into the bear's face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Ghost reared back on his hind legs, pawing at his eyes and nose, temporarily blinded and in considerable pain. Amanda used the precious seconds to drag Richard further from the bear, pulling him by his uninjured arm toward the relative safety of the tents. Tom and Susan had reached the scene, Tom carrying a large camping axe while Susan documented everything with her camera, understanding instinctively that if they survived, there would be an investigation. Lisa had also emerged from her tent and was frantically trying to establish a connection on the satellite phone to call for rescue. "Kodiak Marine! Kodiak Marine! This is an emergency!" Lisa shouted into the phone. "We have a bear attack on private property near Old Harbor. One person severely injured, need immediate helicopter evacuation." The response was immediate. "Copy your emergency." What is your exact location and the nature of the injuries? We're approximately 2 miles northeast of Old Harbor on private property. The victim has been mauled by a large bear. Multiple lacerations, severe blood loss, possible internal injuries. We need a medical helicopter immediately. Roger, we're dispatching a helicopter from the Coast Guard station in Kodiak. ETA approximately 30 minutes. Can you provide a safe landing zone? Lisa looked around the campsite, now a scene of chaos and blood. Affirmative, we have a clearing about 50 yards across, but the bear is still here. It's still attacking. Ghost had recovered from the bear spray and was once again focused on Richard. The bear seemed to understand that its prey was escaping and moved to intercept Amanda as she tried to drag Richard to safety. Tom stepped into the bear's path, raising the axe above his head. "Come on, you bastard!" Tom shouted, his fear transformed into protective rage. "Come and get some!" Ghost paused, evaluating this new threat. Tom was smaller than the bear's usual prey, but he was armed and clearly willing to fight. The bear's tactical mind weighed the options: pursue the wounded prey or deal with the armed defender. The decision was made for him when Jake emerged from behind the lumber pile and fired his remaining shots into Ghost's flank. The bullet struck home, but failed to penetrate deeply enough to reach vital organs. Ghost spun toward Jake with lightning speed, but Jake was already moving, leading the bear away from Richard and Amanda. Amanda reached the tent area and immediately began emergency treatment of Richard's wounds. His pulse was weak and rapid, his blood pressure dropping fast. She had battlefield medical supplies, but was essentially performing trauma surgery in a tent by lantern light. "Susan!" Amanda called. "I need you to help me. Hold pressure on this wound while I work on the artery." Susan Kozlov, despite having no medical training, followed Amanda's instructions with steady hands. She pressed gauze pads against the gaping wounds, while Amanda used hemostats to clamp severed blood vessels. It was brutal, primitive medicine, but it was keeping Richard alive. "How is he?" Tom called from his position guarding the tent. "Bad," Amanda replied honestly. "He's lost a lot of blood, and I think he has internal injuries. If that helicopter doesn't get here soon." She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Richard was dying, and they were fighting for time. Ghost, meanwhile, had treed Jake Morrison. The bear had chased Jake to a large spruce tree at the edge of the clearing, and Jake had scrambled up into the branches barely ahead of Ghost's claws. The bear now stood at the base of the tree, occasionally rearing up and swiping at Jake's dangling feet. "Jake!" Amanda called. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Jake shouted back. "But I'm out of ammunition, and this bastard isn't giving up." Ghost had settled into a patient vigil beneath the tree. The bear seemed to understand that Jake would eventually have to come down, and Ghost was prepared to wait. His territorial instincts were now fully engaged. These humans had invaded his domain and injured him, and his response would be proportional. Lisa had succeeded in establishing communication with the rescue helicopter. "Coast Guard Rescue, this is Lisa Kozlov. We have one critical patient and one person treed by the bear. The bear is still active and aggressive. How do you want to handle the approach?" "Copy that, Miss Kozlov. We're 5 minutes out. Can you provide security for the landing zone?" "Negative. The bear is huge, probably over 1,000 pounds, and it's not backing down. We've shot it multiple times, but it's still mobile and aggressive." "Understood. We have a marksman on board with a large caliber rifle. Can you direct us to the bear's location?" Lisa looked across the clearing to where Ghost maintained his vigil beneath Jake's tree. "Affirmative. The bear is at the northeast edge of the clearing, about 60 yards from the landing zone. The victim is secure in the southwest corner." Dr. Jennifer Walsh had remained in her tent during the initial attack, but she now emerged with additional medical supplies. As an emergency room physician, she was accustomed to trauma cases, but the sight of Richard's injuries shocked even her. "Jesus Christ," Jennifer whispered, kneeling beside Amanda. How long has he been like this? About 20 minutes, Amanda replied, without looking up from her work. I've clamped what I can reach, but he needs surgery. Soon. Jennifer assessed Richard's condition with practiced eyes. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow. He's in hypovolemic shock. We need to get fluids into him. She began setting up an IV line with remarkable speed and efficiency. Will he make it? Susan asked quietly. Jennifer's expression was grim. If we can get him to a trauma center in the next hour, maybe. But it's going to be close. The sound of rotor blades began to echo off the surrounding hills, growing louder by the second. A Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter was approaching from the southeast, its searchlight sweeping the forest below. Coast Guard rescue, I can see your light, Lisa radioed. The patient is in the clearing marked by our flashlights. The bear is still at the tree line. Roger, we have visual on your position. Stand by for marksman deployment. The helicopter circled the clearing once, its searchlight illuminating the scene like a battlefield. Ghost looked up at the aircraft with obvious agitation, his territorial instincts triggered by this new intruder. The bear moved away from Jake's tree and began pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing. A rifle shot rang out from the helicopter, the .338 Lapua Magnum round striking Ghost in the shoulder and spinning him around. The bear roared in pain and fury but remained on his feet. A second shot hit him in the chest and Ghost staggered but refused to go down. Tough son of a bitch, the helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio, deploying for another pass. Ghost was now wounded and enraged beyond rational thought. The bear charged toward the center of the clearing, directly at the group of humans clustered around Richard. Tom stepped forward with his axe, knowing it was futile but unwilling to let the bear reach the wounded man. The third shot from the helicopter struck Ghost in the head, finally bringing down the massive bear. Ghost collapsed less than 20 feet from Richard's position, his great body convulsing briefly before lying still. "Bear is down! Bear is down!" Lisa radioed. "Landing zone is secure." The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of rotor wash and noise. 2 paramedics and a flight surgeon jumped out and ran toward Richard's position, their medical bags and equipment ready. "What do we have?" the flight surgeon shouted over the rotor noise. "Male 58, bear attack," Amanda replied, continuing her chest compressions. "Multiple lacerations, severe blood loss, possible internal injuries. He's been down about 30 minutes. The flight surgeon quickly assessed Richard's condition while the paramedics set up advanced life support equipment. "Let's get him packaged and loaded. This guy needs surgery right now." Working with practiced efficiency, the medical team transferred Richard to a gurney and began moving him toward the helicopter. Amanda and Jennifer followed, providing additional hands and continuing the medical interventions they had started. "Is anyone else injured?" the flight surgeon asked. "I don't think so," Lisa replied. "Jake was treed by the bear, but he should be okay." Jake had indeed climbed down from his refuge and was jogging toward the helicopter. His clothes were torn, and he had scratches on his hands and face, but he was mobile and alert. "I'm fine," Jake said, slightly out of breath. "Just scared out of my mind." The paramedics loaded Richard into the helicopter, while Amanda provided a detailed handoff of his condition and the treatment they had provided. The flight surgeon nodded approvingly at their field medicine. "You two probably saved his life," he told Amanda and Jennifer. "That was good work under impossible conditions." The helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, its lights disappearing rapidly as it headed toward the regional hospital in Kodiak. The survivors stood in the sudden silence, looking at the massive form of Ghost lying motionless in their campsite. Carlos Mendez, who had been monitoring radio traffic from Old Harbor, arrived shortly after the helicopter departure. He brought with him 2 Alaska Department of Fish and Game officers and a local policeman. The investigation into the attack would begin immediately. "Nobody touch anything," Officer Ray Mitchell from the Alaska State Police instructed. This is now a crime scene. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone. Ghost had committed no crime by defending his territory and following his instincts. The true crime, if there was one, lay in humanity's failure to respect the wild places and the wild creatures that inhabited them. Fish and Game Officer Sarah Thompson examined Ghost's body with professional interest. "This is one of the largest bears I've ever seen," she said, taking measurements and photographs. "Probably close to 1,200 pounds. Age estimates, I'd say 12 to 15 years old based on tooth wear." "Was this a normal attack pattern?" Lisa asked. As a wildlife biology student, she was intensely interested in understanding what had gone wrong. "Not really," Thompson replied. "Most bear attacks are defensive, a surprised sow with cubs, or a bear protecting a food source. This appears to have been predatory behavior, which is much rarer. This bear was actively hunting humans." Carlos nodded grimly. "I've been hearing stories about Ghost for years. He was never quite normal in how he responded to people. Most bears will avoid humans if they can, but Ghost seemed curious about them. That curiosity finally got dangerous." The investigation continued through the morning. The officers documented the campsite, the attack scene, and Ghost's carcass. They interviewed each survivor separately, building a timeline of events and trying to understand how the attack had developed. Tom Kozloff was particularly self-critical. "We should have taken the bear sign more seriously," he told Officer Mitchell. "When we found those tracks in camp, we should have moved to a different location." "Hindsight is always perfect," Mitchell replied. "You folks did a lot of things right. Your medical response probably saved Mr. Ellis's life. The survivors began the grim task of breaking camp and preparing to return to civilization. The half-built cabin stood as a monument to Richard's dream and a reminder of how quickly dreams could turn to nightmares. Amanda and Jennifer flew back to Kodiak to continue Richard's medical care. The emergency surgery had been successful in repairing the immediate damage, but Richard's recovery would be long and uncertain. He had lost massive amounts of blood, suffered extensive tissue damage, and would require multiple additional surgeries. Jake and the others returned to the mainland on the evening ferry, exhausted and traumatized by their experience. The story of Ghost and the attack spread quickly through Alaska's tight-knit communities, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness. Richard Ellis survived, though he would never be the same. His left arm was permanently disabled, and he carried extensive scarring from Ghost's claws. More significantly, the psychological trauma of the attack left him unable to return to the wilderness he had once loved. The 40 acres near Old Harbor were eventually sold, and another man's dream cabin was never built. Ghost's body was transported to the University of Alaska for necropsy and scientific study. The examination revealed an unusually large and aggressive specimen with evidence of previous human contact in the form of healed bullet wounds from an encounter years earlier. Scientists theorized that Ghost had learned to associate humans with food, leading to the predatory behavior that culminated in the attack. The cabin project died with Ghost. Richard's insurance covered the medical expenses, but not the lost materials and equipment. The foundation piers still stand in the clearing, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Local guides sometimes point them out to visitors as a reminder that in the wilderness, humans are not always at the top of the food chain. Amanda Chen left nursing to become a wildlife photographer, channeling her trauma into a career documenting the natural world. Her photographs of Kodiak bears have appeared in National Geographic and other publications, always accompanied by respectful warnings about the power and unpredictability of these magnificent predators. Jake Morrison continued working as a fishing guide, but never again participated in wilderness construction projects. He carries the scar of ghosts' claws on his hands and the memory of 20 terrifying minutes in a spruce tree. Dr. Jennifer Walsh returned to her emergency room practice with a new appreciation for the wilderness medicine skills she had learned during the attack. She later established a training program for medical personnel working in remote areas of Alaska. Tom and Susan Kozloff retired permanently from construction work, spending their remaining years in their comfortable home in Anchorage. Tom never again picked up a hammer or saw, and Susan donated all of her construction photographs to the Alaska State Historical Society. Lisa Kozloff completed her wildlife biology degree and now works for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, specializing in human-bear conflict prevention. Her research has led to improved safety protocols for people working in bear country. Carlos Mendez continues to live in Old Harbor, where he serves as an unofficial expert on bear behavior for visitors to Kodiak Island. He tells the story of Ghost to anyone who will listen, emphasizing the importance of respecting the wild places and the wild creatures that call them home. The story of Ghost and Richard Ellis became a case study in wildlife management programs throughout North America. It serves as a reminder that even experienced outdoorsmen can make fatal mistakes when they underestimate the intelligence and adaptability of wild predators. Today, Richard Ellis lives in a senior community in Anchorage, his wilderness dreams replaced by the reality of daily physical therapy and the constant management of chronic pain. He never speaks publicly about the attack, but those close to him say he still sometimes wakes in the night, calling out warnings about pale shapes moving through the forest. The clearing where Richard's cabin was to have stood has been reclaimed by the wilderness. Young spruce trees grow through the gaps in the foundation piers, and berry bushes have spread across the former campsite. Wildlife has returned to the area: deer, foxes, smaller bears that pose no threat to humans. But the locals in Old Harbor still call it Ghost's Clearing, and few people venture there without remembering the November morning when man's ancient contract with the wilderness was written in blood. In the end, the story of Ghost and Richard Ellis is not a story about good versus evil or civilization versus savagery. It is a story about the thin line that separates the human world from the wild world, and what happens when that line is crossed by those who do not fully understand the rules that govern life and death in the wilderness. Ghost died defending his territory as his instincts demanded. Richard Ellis survived but lost his dream and his faith in the wilderness that had once called to him. And somewhere in the forests of Kodiak Island, other bears continue to live their ancient lives, following the same instincts that drove Ghost to his final, fatal encounter with humanity. The wilderness endures, beautiful and terrible, indifferent to human dreams and human suffering alike. It offers its gifts to those who approach with proper respect and preparation, but it shows no mercy to those who mistake its beauty for gentleness or its silence for acceptance. The story of Ghost serves as a reminder that in the wild places of the world, humans are visitors, not masters, and the terms of that visitation are always subject to change without notice. Richard's cabin was never built, but his story lives on as a testament to the power of the wild and the price of overconfidence in the face of nature's most magnificent and dangerous predators. In the end, Ghost claimed victory not through malice, but through the simple exercise of his rightful place as king of his forest domain. The wilderness had spoken, and Richard Ellis had learned its language in the hardest way possible. The tale serves as both a cautionary story and a reminder of our place in the natural order. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where mountains meet the sea and ancient forests hold secrets older than human memory, the bears still roam as they have for millennia. They ask nothing from us but respect, and they give nothing but the truth of their nature. For those wise enough to heed the warnings and humble enough to accept their status as visitors in the bear's domain, the wilderness offers experiences of profound beauty and spiritual renewal. For those who forget these simple truths, the wilderness offers lessons written in scars and remembered in nightmares. Ghost is gone now, but his legacy lives on in the improved safety protocols, the greater respect for bear behavior, and the hard-won wisdom of those who survived his final lesson. His story has probably prevented other attacks by educating people about the realities of living and working in bear country. In death, Ghost became a teacher, though his curriculum was written in a language older and more primal than any human tongue. The forest around Old Harbor continues its eternal cycles, indifferent to human ambition and human tragedy alike. The salmon still run in the streams, the berries still ripen in the clearings, and the bears still roam their ancient paths. And sometimes, on quiet November mornings, when the mist clings to the forest floor, local guides tell their clients that you can still see Ghost moving through the trees, a pale shadow reminding all who venture into the wild that they do so at the pleasure of forces far greater and more ancient than themselves. The last nail was never driven into Richard Ellis's dream cabin, but the story of its attempted construction has been hammered into the collective memory of all who seek to build their dreams in the wild places of the world. It stands as a monument not to human failure, but to the enduring power of the wilderness and the eternal truth that in the dance between civilization and savagery, the music is always written by the wild.